have died.
Well, in many European countries, care home residents have been bypassed by overstretched healthcare services. In France, almost a third of all coronavirus deaths have happened in such facilities. Charlotte Dubinsky has more.
As the grim toll from COVID-19 continues to mount, official figures often omit deaths outside hospitals, including those in nursing and care homes. A picture is now emerging of how the virus is laying waste to some of the most fragile. While many older people have been self-isolating at home and hopefully safeguarding their health as much as possible, it seems that others in care homes are more at risk. In France, the death toll rose rapidly after it emerged how many people in care homes had lost their lives to the virus. Those deaths now account for more than 30% of total fatalities. But this isn't surprising. From the very start, we were warned that older people were at highest risk.
The most important task will be to protect our elderly and most vulnerable people during the peak weeks.
La priorité de la nation est de protéger.
The priority of the nation is to protect our elderly. We must do it responsibly, with common sense and discipline.
Strong words from those in charge, yet words that some say have rung hollow as the elderly bear the brunt of the virus. In Spain, nursing and care homes have been struggling to stop the spread of COVID-19. It's estimated that in March alone, nearly 5,000 people in care homes in the Madrid region died. That's thousands of deaths higher than normal. A correspondent from our sister channel, RT Spanish, Francisco Gaita, told me that in some places, care homes have become de facto hospitals.
When the virus spread out, and it's very difficult to keep in a residence that there were different parties, musical, there's a lot of activities, there were the families inside, and start to appear cases of COVID-19, and at that time the situation become very difficult for care homes because for them they need to act as a hospitals.
Francisco's mother was living in one home, but following complications, she's been transferred to a hospital where she's fighting pneumonia. Although it's not yet been confirmed, she is also being treated as if she's been infected by COVID-19. As a reporter, Francisco knows the drill, but as a son, he says the hardest thing is to not be with her in person.
COVID-19 is very cruel because you cannot hug your mother, you cannot kiss her, you cannot be with her. And this isolation is very tough for the patient and for the relatives, that we cannot be close to her in these circumstances. When you are in the middle of this pandemic, I think it's very difficult. But there were some messages that they were saying, for example, that all people is a priority, that it was not true. It was not true, and it's clear with the facts that you see how many old people in care homes died in the last weeks. It's thousands of people, of old people, that they are dying because of the COVID-19.
The outbreaks in care homes in Spain have led to a collapse in staffing. Last month, the military was called to help at a retirement home, and it found elderly residents who'd been abandoned and in some cases dead in their beds. Meanwhile, in Italy, an investigation has been launched after dozens died at a nursing home in Milan. One worker at the facility said the true extent of the risk of infection had been played down while staff had been told not to wear masks.
The situation isn't good. They've covered everything up. There were even 4 people who came, including a female doctor, who terrorized us, saying we didn't have to use masks.
In the UK, government guidelines say COVID-19 patients can be safely cared for in care homes if precautions are taken. But some care home managers say that by doing so, the government is sacrificing the elderly.
That would be tantamount to importing death into care homes. And I think to add insult to injury by asking us to take COVID-19 positive patients is asking us to basically make out suicide notes for people in care.
We are taught from a young age to respect our elders, to look after our elderly. Yet as the panic has ensued with the pandemic, those key lessons, those early reassuring overtures from leaders feel like in some cases they have evaporated. Charlotte Dziebinski, RT, Paris.
Meanwhile, hospitals around the world are having to suspend vital services at the moment as they focus on COVID-19 patients. We'll have more details on this a bit later in the programme. Now, the US does have the unenviable record at the moment of having the world's fastest growing death toll from the pandemic. The figure has topped 17,000 and is expected to overtake Italy within a matter of days. In New York State, 7,000 lives have been lost there and morgues have been overwhelmed. In fact, in this video, you can see workers in protective gear there burying the dead in a trench on Hart Island in the Bronx. The area has traditionally been used to bury those with no known relatives. Trinity Chavez sent this report from the city.
Female, difficulty breathing, can't speak in full sentences, has pneumonia.
Today, the coronavirus continuing to take a dramatic toll on New York.
It's like a battlefield behind your home.
The number of coronavirus cases now more than 150,000 with more than 7,000 deaths. The virus having the biggest impact on some of New York City's poorest areas.
The disparities that have plagued this city, this nation, that are all about fundamental inequality, are once again causing such pain and causing people, innocent people, to lose their lives. It's just abundantly clear. It's sick. It's troubling. It's wrong.
New data showing Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and Corona, Queens have higher numbers of coronavirus cases than in wealthy, mostly white parts of Manhattan.
I feel like people here who get treated here are getting treated like in a different manner than people in Manhattan or of the higher wealth.
Oh, it's terrifying here because we're downwind of this of a hospital that's the epicenter of the national crisis.
While Queens, the epicenter of the outbreak in New York City, accounts for more than 3,200 infections, many are still forced to continue to go to work.
Yeah, my mom is definitely worried. She's wanted me to stop coming here, but I mean, she's not working, my father's not working, my sister doesn't work because she's young, so this is the only source of income for now.
Many low-wage workers on the front lines, from grocery store employees to public transportation workers, all deemed essential, working around the clock during the pandemic.
Right now, everybody's out here risking their lives if they're still working.
The MTA confirming the coronavirus has claimed the lives of 41 transit workers in 5 weeks, and more than 6,000 have fallen sick or self-quarantined. This as new research shows that the novel coronavirus likely circulated in New York for weeks undetected, with more New York infections coming from Europe and not Asia. Critics pointing out that the findings contradict President Trump's argument that his ban on travelers from China in late January delayed the arrival of the virus to the U.S. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
Well, economies have been badly hit, and for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, large parts of Africa are entering recession due to the pandemic. That's according to the World Bank, and it does threaten to push millions into extreme poverty, it says. Saskia Taylor has been looking at the issue.
The world has now realised it's facing not just a health crisis, but also potential economic collapse.
Global growth will turn sharply negative in 2020. In fact, we anticipate the worst economic fallout since the Great Depression.
Now, these numbers are dramatic under any standard. Comparisons with the 2008 financial crisis and even the Great Depression of the 1930s are inevitable.
In the US, an estimated 16 million people have filed unemployment claims over the past 3 weeks alone. If that is happening to the world's economic superpower, what bleak future awaits everyone else? Take Africa, for example. The World Bank says that COVID-19 is threatening to tip the continent into its first recession in 25 years.
We will see a complete collapse of economies and livelihoods. Livelihoods will be wiped out in a way we have never seen before.
If the analysis proves right, coronavirus could cost the continent up to half of its GDP in 2020. Why? Well, Africa is one of the most export-dependent regions in the world. But with countries shutting their borders, the continent can't trade like before. That's on top of reduced tourism and low oil prices. The number of coronavirus cases in Africa is so far relatively low, around 11,000. But there are concerns it's just the calm before the storm.
Case numbers are increasing exponentially in the African region. It took 16 days from the first confirmed case in the region to reach 100 cases. It took a further 10 days to reach the first 1,000. 3 days after this, there were 2,000 cases, and 2 days later, we were at 3,000.
If this pattern continues, African nations which already have fragile health systems will just simply be overwhelmed.
We don't have the hospitals, the ICUs, or the ventilators to deal with massive amounts of people. So if the spread is comparable to that seen in Europe or China, the outcome could be devastating.
The coronavirus would actually affect healthcare services across the world, but more so African countries who are clearly not prepared, who are clearly have hospitals that are underfunded and ill-equipped, many of them, and of course the labour market, especially the doctors and nurses, very in short supply. So true problematic issues for many of the African countries right now.
To try and get ahead of the pandemic, many countries have enforced containment measures like lockdowns, curfews and travel bans, but that has led to its own slew of problems. Overzealous policing has already cost lives. In Kenya, there are reports of police beatings, and the president himself apologised for the death of a 13-year-old boy at the hands of an officer's stray bullet. Meanwhile, South Africa has taken the unprecedented step of going into a military-patrolled lockdown. Human rights groups also allege these lockdowns are being taken advantage of by authoritarian regimes to consolidate their power and also to thwart social uprisings as joblessness continues to rise. The timing of the pandemic is particularly bad for Africa. A number of its nations are only now recovering from the Ebola outbreak, and in the east, a swarm of locusts is threatening to devastate crops.
If we fail with the current regional control operations because of a lack of pesticides, then we could see 4 million more people struggle to feed their families.
So, while the coronavirus is making life around the world difficult, for the 1.3 billion living on the African continent, it threatens to undermine individual freedoms, collapse healthcare systems, and bring about economic ruin.
Africa is meant to be an agricultural producing continent, and in many cases, many countries in Africa have sought the element of mineral wealth, and as we've seen, that doesn't necessarily play in good hands. So if people who live on a dollar a day, nearly 70% of many population sizes across the African continent are on a dollar a day, those people who've been asked to stay at home, if at all that's the case, who's actually going to take care of them? Their breadlines are going to be affected, their ability to be able to feed their families and themselves are really strained, and more than likely the African people will suffer when supply chains are terribly affected, which they will be, and we've already seen that to be the case.
Saskia Taylor with that report. Now, still to come for you this hour, preying on fear, we do look at the fraudsters who are currently trying to cash in on the pandemic. That story, plus others too, just after the break.
Kaiser's Financial Survival Guide, liquid assets are those that you can convert into cash quite easily. But keep in mind, no assets immune to inflation. Better watch Crash Report.
Is your media a reflection of reality? In a world transformed, what will make you feel safer? Isolation or community? Are you going the right way or are you being led somewhere? Which direction? What is truth? What is fake? In a world corrupted, you need to descend. So join us in the depths, or remain in the shallows.
Hello again, you're with RT. Now, in a bid to stabilise what have been plunging oil prices, the world's major producers, including Russia, have finally reached an agreement to slash production. Mexico had been the only country refusing to come on board. However, it was eventually persuaded to follow suit. Presidents Putin and Trump, too, have just discussed the current situation and agreed on maintaining dialogue about the market. With more details, here's Don Corter.
The world's oil-producing hard hitters have finally come to this historic agreement to cut around 10 million barrels of oil a day on the global oil markets in production. Now, this plan means the avoidance of a potential disaster for the world's oil markets, and Moscow has already predicted good things to come as a result of it.
The compromise between 22 countries will have a stabilizing effect on the global market. There are no losers. Everybody has won from this decision. Producers, consumers, and the global economy as well.
Now, this agreement comes after a month-long price war between Moscow and Riyadh that started when Saudi Arabia dramatically increased its oil production, and that sent global oil prices to record lows. Now, on Thursday, OPEC Plus called on its member states to assist in efforts intended to stabilize the international oil markets, and Mexico was actually the longest. They took the longest to fall in line with this. But after the country's president spoke with Donald Trump, he said that they were able to cut a deal.
We were in touch with President Trump. I spoke with him and an agreement was reached to make a cut of 100,000 barrels per day. The United States has committed to an additional decrease of 250,000 barrels to compensate for Mexico. This is formal. We are already complying with this.
So now the world's major oil-producing countries are on the same page. We'll no doubt see a greater degree of stability in the international markets as a result of it.
All right, well, let's get more reaction now from Andy Lipow. He joins us. He's from he's president of Lipow Oil Associates, based in Houston, Texas. You're very welcome. Thanks for coming on, Andy. Why do you think Mexico changed its mind on this so quickly? Because just 24 hours ago, it was saying it wasn't going to cut production.
Well, I think the main reason is that Mexico, rather than having to cut 400,000 barrels a day, ended up cutting only 100,000 barrels a day, because at the root of the OPEC agreement was to have Saudi Arabia and Russia bear the most cuts, but the rest of the countries would cut by 23%, and Mexico was able to reduce their percentage cut to only 6%.
If that is the case, why is it so important to get Mexico on board? Because they're not a major oil producer, they don't seem to be cutting much in terms of global output. So just why was it so important to get everybody on the same page?
Well, the key was that OPEC on its own was unwilling to cut production and shoulder the burden without having the 10 members of OPEC Plus also contribute to that production cut. Of course, Russia is the biggest member of the Plus group. Mexico is also a member as well. But in addition to this 10 million barrel a day cut, OPEC Plus wanted non-OPEC members such as the US, Canada, Brazil, and Norway to join in to reduce the supply overload that we have. And because OPEC did not want to be, if you will, supporting shale and these other producers.
So what sort of impact do you think this will have on the price then? Will the markets buy into this?
Well, I think the markets may react with a little bit of skepticism for a number of reasons. First, the production cut doesn't go into effect until May, and here we are in April where the supply-demand imbalance on crude oil is about 25 million barrels a day. Second, we actually saw some hint of this on Friday where the initial contours of a agreement were announced and the oil price was up about 12%, but by the end of the day when the details came out it was down by 9% because it's a reflection of the market's skepticism that everyone in this group is actually going to comply.
Well, that's a good point. How easy is it to police this? I mean, somebody might say they're going to do something, but how would you prove that they haven't cut production?
Well, you only can prove it really after the fact, and we've seen a difficulty in the compliance by a lot of the members. So when we think about some of the OPEC members, such as Nigeria or Algeria, it's very difficult to imagine that they're actually going to cut by 23%. And this is all going on at the same time that Libyan oil production, for all intents and purposes, is off the market. And should that begin to return, that's another 1 million barrels a day that OPEC and non-OPEC members would have to contend with.
Yeah, okay, it's not a clear-cut issue, is it, at the moment? Andy, we're going to have to leave it there. Always good to talk to you. That was Andy Lipow, Lipow Oil Associates in Houston, Texas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, with health services around the world engaged almost solely in the fight against the coronavirus, it means that the focus has been taken off many other crucial sectors. In the US, there's been a drop by up to nearly 60% in admissions for those suffering heart attacks. Spain's seen a 40% cut in emergency procedures, and patients seeking heart care in Hong Kong have reported lengthy delays, while a doctor in New York has revealed that patients are refusing to come in over fears that they will be infected.
Housing in the hospitals, it's overcrowded. COVID-19 patients are going to have to wait for a long time just to get upstairs to a bed where they're probably going to share a room or go in the hallways with other COVID-19 patients. I have patients come in crying and screaming that they don't want to be sent to the emergency room from the nursing home because they had a fever. They're screaming that they don't want the virus. Don't take me back, take me back. But they know they're being sent to certain doom because they're going to just inhale the air of an emergency room where the patients are 90% of them are testing positive COVID-19, coughing and sneezing.
That said, though, British Dr. David Bull, who is a former MEP, does say that no one should be scared of going to hospital if they need treatment.
Really key advice to people is the hospitals remain open if you have a serious condition. So for example, if you have angina, if you have chest pain, if you have anything that you're really worried about, then you must seek medical help. Because actually, strangely, the public are actually listening to the advice that's being given, and many of the wards are relatively quiet at the moment. So if you are concerned, if you have a life-threatening illness, then please make sure that you go to the hospital. We have ramped up medical provision. We have called back lots of retired doctors, lots of retired nurses back onto the front line. So we've also built these other bigger units like the Nightingale Hospital, which is 2,000 bed wards. I mean, that's extraordinary. So the capacity of the NHS has increased dramatically, but that means there are still many doctors around to deal with those conditions that are nothing to do with coronavirus itself.
However, the UK's National Health Service is still showing some strain. Ambulance waiting times, for example, in London have tripled, and many hospitals have outsourced key services to private clinics. We heard from a cancer patient.
I had an operation scheduled for next week, and it was cancelled. It's recurrent breast cancer. I had a lot of treatment about five years ago and ongoing treatment, and unfortunately it's returned, and it needs an operation sooner rather than later. This will be outsourced to a clinic, but it's an NHS clinic. Okay. And the consultant hasn't operated there before, so he's being very cautious and very careful to make sure that everything's safe.
Meanwhile, scientists are still warning that a vaccine for the coronavirus is still likely to be more than a year away, although that gap in the market has allowed fraudsters to step in, offering fake treatments. With more on this, here's Murat Gastiev.
It's always like this, isn't it? Especially in times of desperation, when mankind is gripped by fear and despair. They crawl out from under their rocks. The charlatans, the profiteers, the slimes and the sleazers. Even among them are those of exceptional shamelessness.
I'm asking for a brief furlough of 3 months to assist in research work on COVID-19. Being released to the post-COVID world is no solace to even the incarcerated.
Martin Scarelli, a former drug industry executive, a liar, a fraud, a Ponzi scheme creator. But those were his official crimes. What Scarelli really became infamous for is creating a monopoly over a parasitic infection drug used to treat pregnant women, babies, HIV victims. He got his hands on this drug and he hiked the price from $20 per pill to $750 per pill. It was ingenious and utterly soulless. You either paid or you died.
Healthcare prices are inelastic. I could have raised it higher and made more profits for our shareholders. This is a capitalist society, capitalist system, and capitalist rules.
Beware these vultures, those promising a cure, medicine, or a secret formula to ward off coronavirus spirits. And for a pretty penny, they'll tell you it came from God.
God gave us this product, I believe.
Yes.
You're saying that silver solution would be effective.
There's no silver bullet, there's no silver pill, and I promise you there's no silver toothpaste. Yes, toothpaste. That's not a joke.
The patented nanosilver we have, the Pentagon has come out and documented, and Homeland Security, and said this stuff kills the whole SARS corona family at point blank range.
So ludicrous were his claims that authorities in New York had to step in and to tell him to stop this charade. It's easy to blame the victims here. You could call them silly or stupid, or you could try to understand them, the elderly especially, who are trusting, who are told daily on television that they're in the high-risk category, that they're likely to die first. Of course they're desperate. Can you blame them for grasping at straws? No. What you can do is you can blame the con artists who are waving these straws in front of their faces.
Not only did I create the cure, but this pill right here is the prevention.
We can go on and on. There are thousands of these charlatans all over the world, more every day. Don't just walk by, report them. Make a complaint on Facebook, on Twitter if you see a post. Don't just scroll on. The only thing worse than waiting for a cure is being fooled into buying one only to learn that it's fake and someone during the pandemic profited off of our collective misery.
Whenever something happens of a catastrophic nature, you see a number of sometimes altruistic, but oftentimes despicable. For example, price gouging. In this country, there were people who were selling Purell, these hand lotion types of things, for $200 a bottle. It was ridiculous. Face masks. So that's one example. Then you have televangelists or others who ply their spiritual wares, maybe legitimately. I'm not equipped with the ability to tell whether they're correct or not. That's for others to decide. Then you also have a variety of people who during this will make statements about the cause of this, so-called conspiracy theories. Now again, I'm not saying anybody in particular, but you're going to see everybody from every walk of life use this somehow. I've heard radio promotions, sometimes tawdry, despicable. So whatever the human imagination can provide, that's what you'll see.
And that brings you up to date for now. We'll be back with more for you in about 30 minutes' time. In the meantime, though, do stay at home and stay with us.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. With the coronavirus now officially declared a pandemic, the world faces the additional burden of an oil market collapse. This comes at a time when demand for crude was already low. Some are calling this the ultimate perfect storm. How this all ends is anyone's guess. Cross-talking crude carnage, I'm joined by my guest, Kamil Wozny in Beirut. He's a professor of economics and international affairs. In Irvine, we have Pai Ian. He is an independent economic and geopolitical analyst, as well as a former commodities trader. And in Toronto, we cross to Alessandro Bruno. He is an analyst at Gulf State Analytics. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Pai, let me go to you first in Irvine, because you got up earliest for this program here. All right, it all happened quite quickly. A lot of analysts weren't too surprised. The deal that the Russians and the Saudis had collapsed. The Russians didn't go along with what the Saudis wanted to do, and the Saudis reacted. And now we have carnage on the oil markets here. What is Saudi Arabia's gambit here? Because, you know, if you look at its budgetary constraints, it can't afford to have low oil for a very long time, and we throw in the coronavirus that is also hurting crude demand all across the world. What's the gambit? Go ahead, Pai.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the timing, the gambit, as well as just everything, all this turmoil and black swans concurrently happening around the world really kind of begs certain geopolitical questions, in my opinion. You have coronavirus more or less announced, really kind of commencing on New Year's Eve, and then the rollout is fairly rapid. And, you know, in a sense, the intention being kind of collapsing of, as you said, already low energy demand. But as energy demand, especially within China, is collapsing, then, you know, you have the announcement of the pandemic. And the timing then of OPEC, really Saudi Arabia, and to a certain extent now UAE, you know, just insisting on the pullback, which would in turn affect the medium-term desired from Russia to capture more of the global market share within the energy space. And at some point there was a butting of heads. Russia, I sense, saw through certain coordination issues. You had unofficial accusations of coronavirus having been triggered out in the West from Russia as well as from Iran. And Russia did, you know, they do their math, they do their homework, and they sense that they can ride out a price war much better than the very over-leveraged, you know, $50 billion budget constraint at Saudi Arabia that needs $83 a barrel of oil in order to balance its budgets, as well as fund its longer-term visions of getting off of oil and expanding its economy under the vision of Mohammed bin Salman. So it's really, people have to look at this as a sense of these are not just necessarily coincidences in my point of view, because the ruble was strengthening last year. Russia has been on a de-dollarization platform in order to diversify away from dollar reliance, in part to fight sanctions thrown against it as well as its partners, but also to strengthen its own ambitions to have its currency, the currency of its allies, really rival, if not trounce, the 47-year-old petrodollar standard, which is the effective monopoly globally with regard to oil or gas pricing. So there's a lot of, you know, it's a game of chicken really behind the scenes to see who is going to be able to sustain.
Exactly, and there's a lot of moving parts, as you've just explained here. Come on, let's go to you in Beirut here. I mean, please explain to me why Saudi Arabia thinks that Russia, for example, is going to blink first. Now, its lifting costs are very, very low, but its budgetary constraints are extraordinary, considering what the Crown Prince wants to achieve there. And Russia's got a pretty good piggy bank to ride out these tribulations, the price fluctuations that we're experiencing right now. I don't understand the Saudi reasoning here. Go ahead in Beirut.
Well, obviously, it could be there is no reasoning. They're making the same mistake they made in 2014. They put themselves in a big deficit and a big hole, and they're doing the same mistake all over again. there is no economic victory for the Saudi by entering into confrontation with Russia into this end. It will backfire. It actually backfired, and probably they have to go into the open market and borrow more money and be in more debt. We all know that their break-even to balance their budget has to be around $80 now. The oil is close to in this area. It might be lower. So actually they can be in a deep trouble, especially they have in a war with Yemen and they have in a war now with Russia, and probably they will face a very difficult situation, especially now Aramco is traded on the exchange. Yep. We've seen in the couple days how this Aramco share has tumbled, and all the wealth that MBS actually projected is going to be the stock is going to bring Saudi Arabia back into the market, and he can use all that wealth and investment from Aramco to rebuild Saudi Arabia. Now Aramco is in a deep trouble, and the Saudis in deep trouble. I think my best estimate, they miscalculated. They should have gone along with the Russian, coordinating their effort. That will be more helpful at this point.
You know, let's go to Toronto. Alessandro, it's very interesting because it is public knowledge that Russia has planned for something like this. Oh, and they have a budget set, separate budgets at a certain price of oil. I mean, it can go as low as 25, and the Russians can ride it out. Okay, I mean, they don't want it to be that low, but they've made budgetary considerations to be able to deal with that. The Saudis should have known that. It's not a secret. Go ahead in Toronto.
Yes, well, I think the Saudis have no idea what they're doing, and I had to dig up some history to get some clarity, because there was no scenario that seemed to me plausible that could produce some advantage for Saudi Arabia right now. One of the scenarios is in the 1980s, the Saudis cut off production to sustain prices. But at that time, the effect was to invite more producers into the game, forcing more competition on them. So that backfired in the 80s. Now they're trying the scorched earth trajectory, which seems to be, though, directed to me. To me, it seems more directed toward the U.S. shale producers than anyone else, because they're the biggest losers, and U.S. banks that gave them the loans. In fact, this could really trigger another 2000 financial crisis, and we're seeing the effects in the market already.
Well, you got ahead of me because you're reading my mind across the world there, because that's exactly one of the things that I've been thinking about here. Let's go back to Irvine. I mean, is the U.S. shale industry really the target of all of this? The Saudis have been complaining about it endlessly. It's expanded into the oil market tremendously over the last 10 years. Is this the real target of Saudi Arabia? Not the Russians, the Americans. Go ahead, in Irvine.
I think the shale issue is in a large part a red herring, Peter, because your other guests are hinting at it there. This is a currency and really currency standard for energy trading war that's happening, but that cannot be announced in the mainstream corporate press, U.S., U.K., or Europe, because of the sensitivities. These are like, discussing the matters of the financial risks posed to the banking system, really from rivals across Eurasia, rivaling the dollar standard is equivalent to discussing the nuclear codes in corporate press. So they have to go about it saying that, oh, look, Russia now, is targeting our shale sector. What Russia is doing is essentially geopolitical and geoeconomic jujitsu, or judo, or aikido. You choose the martial art. Okay, the West has traditionally, as your other guest referenced, utilized the oil price for geopolitical purposes. Mid-'80s, there was a tactical drop in the energy price to torpedo the Soviet Union. You had it reprised again, with Iran in kind of 76, 77 to take care of a wayward, disobedient Shah of Iran back then. And then just 6 years ago, you had a aggressive drop that was coordinated in the price of oil to affect the books of Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, really kind of nations that have been leaning eastward or leaning certainly away from the Washington consensus. This time, you had enough slack to where Russia was reading the tea leaves, preparing itself, going, despite seeing eye to eye with the Saudis on various things over the past few years, sensing that this could be a tactical maneuver. Why? Again, I'm a broken record on this. No one within Saudi Arabia runs Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia takes diktat from banks within London and New York, and this is, that's why there's infighting within the House of Saud. You have Mohammed bin Salman arresting, other members of the House of Saud, is because there is the wanting to lean further towards the east because the numbers and the economics in the longer term are more sustainable and make sense. Whereas you have the traditional relationship, you have the post-World War II establishment, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that has evolved into what the petrodollar set up after the gold standard ended in the early 70s, and that paradigm is starting to give. None of this can be discussed out in the open. You don't have analysts on Bloomberg or CNBC or in the FT or whatnot bluntly discussing the risks. But as your other guest hinted, there's already a carouseling or a cascading effect within Western finance. A 6-month spell of oil below $40 could devalue as much of the Western financial system because $1.9 trillion is the amount of energy or debt that's tied up just between larger banks as well as mid-tier banks and energy producers. And when the U.S. has nothing else, really the West has nothing else but to throw the kitchen sink in order to try and prevent an eclipsing of the dollar standard, what it's doing, it's shooting itself in the foot.
Exactly. One of the things that's very interesting is that you use the dollar as a political weapon. It comes back like a boomerang and hits you. This is what I've been saying for years here. You shouldn't use it as a political weapon. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on crude carnage. Stay with RT.
Join me every Thursday on The Alex Salmond Show, when I'll be speaking to guests on the world of politics, sport, business, and show business. I'll see you then.
Max Kaiser's Financial Survival Guide. They say money doesn't grow on trees. Oh, look, quantitative easing. This is how central banks support dying economies. I'm going to call them right now and say, stop the madness! Stop the madness!
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing crude carnage. Okay, let's go back to Kamal in Beirut. On this program, I always try to avoid hyperbole, but it seems to me, considering the behavior of Saudi Arabia over the last couple of years under the nominal leadership of the Crown Prince here, he's putting the entire kingdom at risk, isn't he? This is an extraordinary gambit. Pi just gave us the numbers there, and I think that's just the top level. I mean, when you see the whole financialization of the energy markets here, it doesn't take much to rattle the cage, and the cage is being rattled. Go ahead in Beirut.
Yeah, obviously he's taken a huge risk, which is going to backfire, as we said early, and probably he's going to hear it from the President of the United States, because it's going to backfire not on him, it's going to backfire on Mr. Trump himself, because he built his reputation as he's going to make the U.S. independent in terms of oil and gas, and today there is screaming in the United States from all these oil company who's actually most of their stocks in the red. Some of them is down 50%, some of them down 70 and 80%, and some of them heavily in debt, and basically they're going to go into bankruptcy protection. So I think today probably somebody from those oil lobby, they wanted Mohammed bin Salman head because they put him into Arab business. This is in reality, it does help Russia on the other hand, because the United States, Mr. Trump, he tried to put sanction against Russia and North.
There's another case there, Ebola case. I guess my question is for Maria, if I could please. Can you give us a better sense at this point about the breakdown of mild and moderate cases? What is the percentage of cases that you would call mild, and how do you define mild, and then what is moderate at this point?
Hi, Helen. Thank you for that question. So, as you know, we've been looking at the proportion of cases that have developed disease, that have developed mild disease, or moderate disease, that have developed severe disease, critical disease, and have and most of the data that we have, with a very clear breakdown of this, came from China initially, which suggested 80% were being mild and moderate, 40% being mild, 40% being moderate. That moderate category includes pneumonia that doesn't need hospitalization. So it is still a significant infection, significant disease, and I'm sure many of you have seen people who have experienced COVID-19 say, "This isn't an easy thing to get through. It's pretty tough, even though I didn't need hospitalization." So moderate disease does include pneumonia. What we're trying to get a better handle on, and we're getting this through our expert networks, we're talking directly with clinicians from all affected countries who are directly with patients, is what is that proportion, what does that breakdown look like in different countries? The challenge with that is when you look at it at the national level, it doesn't give you the details that you need at that sub-national level looking at certain populations. For example, when we know that there are individuals who have underlying conditions, we know that that group, or older people who are over 60 years old, that group can have a very different breakdown in terms of how many of them will develop severe disease. In all of our models and our forecasting tools, we use a breakdown of 40% mild, 40% moderate, 15% critical, and 5% severe. And we feel that that's a good basis for some of these projections and some of these tools to be able to prepare for supply. But as new data becomes available, we will modify those.
I would just add to Helen, I think, and thank you for your concern regarding Eastern Congo. I think we obviously our sympathies are with the family of the person who has been lost, but the positive news is that the government of Congo, partners of the WHO, every day we investigate 2,600 alerts across the two affected provinces still. We take thousands of samples every single week. And we will continue that active surveillance right the way through. And we'll just have to go again for another 42 days. It's a testament to the strength and resilience of our people, to the local workers who continue to trace and track, continue to investigate, continue to report, and continue to leave in place the infrastructure. The government of Congo and ourselves, with our partners, are ready to respond and react if things were in any way to deteriorate. And in that sense, maybe that's our lesson for COVID-19. There is no exit strategy until you're in control of the situation, and you must always be ready to go back again and start again. And in that sense, I think there are some lessons there to learn by ensuring that the infrastructure you have on the ground is capable of dealing with the unexpected. Never be surprised.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that question. Next question comes from Mr. Esmir Milovic from N1 Television from Sarajevo, Bosnia. Mr. Milovic?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
My question is for Dr. Tedros, and you spoke about that a bit, but I want to ask you for a further comment. We lost recently in Bosnia-Herzegovina one of the leading experts on this field who passed away, and he worked with the WHO, and that's a very hard situation. Dr. Pakovic has passed away, and we have conflicting informations here why he had passed. He was infected home, and that's a very hard situation. And we hear from other medical doctors and nurses and workers around the world. So what we can do to prevent situations like this in the future, and also what we can do to increase money for research, which is necessary at the moment, and we know that many countries are talking about that. Thank you so much.
I think it's always been true, and it's more true than ever in this response. Frontline health workers have always been unfortunate areas in epidemic response, particularly in systems with strong surveillance systems. The number of times in my career where the death of a health worker was actually the event that triggers epidemic response. Too many times in my career that has been a tragic stimulus to action. We owe a huge debt to our frontline health workers, and they ask for nothing more than the training and the protective gear to do their jobs. And we need to ensure that they get that. We also need to ensure for the future that surveillance systems are in place, that we're able to prevent infection spreading in hospitals. Again, as we're dealing with the outbreak situation in Congo, at one point during the outbreak of Ebola in Beni, at one of the most intense periods in the outbreak, nearly 70% of the cases were actually being transmitted within the healthcare system. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us with MERS, with SARS, with Ebola, that the healthcare environment is an environment in which people can be saved and treated, but it is also an environment in which viruses and other things are present, and we need to protect patients and we need to protect those health workers. It takes a long time to build a health workforce, and it should not be sacrificed to any virus, and it should be protected. Especially true in countries that have invested precious development funds in building a health workforce, which is central and vital to the health system. A health system is not bricks and mortar. The health system is not technology and infrastructure. That's part of it. The heart of the health system are the health workers. And everybody knows that. And we do have a short-term objective now, and that is to get the best possible protection for those workers. And all of us have a responsibility. But also for the long term, we have to handle that. We can no longer leave healthcare systems exposed to infectious diseases without the protection and the capacity to manage those. And that's going to be a big discussion that needs to happen, and I believe should happen before this. But the Director General may have a comment to make on this, because he's involved in much discussion with this, with our G20 partners and others, on how we strengthen the system and never let this happen again.
Yes, so just to add to, in addition to the personal protective gear that we must provide to our frontline workers in masks, medical masks and respirators, gloves, gowns, and we must train our healthcare workers. So what we've seen from the recent studies that have been published on healthcare worker infections, which we're very grateful to see evidence around this. I first should say sorry for the loss that you mentioned. What we must do is we must train our healthcare workers for respiratory diseases, for infectious diseases, because what we've seen is in some initial cases of healthcare worker infections, they've been infected in different wards where they're not used to infectious diseases. They may be long-term care wards for older individuals, and so they just don't have the training. And right now, with COVID-19 circling the globe, all healthcare workers must know about this virus. They must know how this is transmitted, and they must know how to protect themselves. We have trainings that we've put up on our Open WHO platform, which are interactive, which could teach healthcare workers about what this virus is, how it is transmitted, and how they can protect themselves. And not only what needs to be worn, but how to put the materials on, how to put the PPE on, how to take the PPE off safely. We must also find ways in which we can provide psychosocial support to our healthcare workers and our frontline workers, because this is a very difficult position that all of them are put in now or will be put in countries that have not yet seen large numbers of cases. We need to find ways in which we can provide some rest periods for them so that they don't have very long extended shifts or too long of extended shifts, and they have ample time to rest. Because when fatigue sets in, it's possible that maybe the personal protective equipment isn't taken off properly. And that's not to blame the healthcare worker. So there are things that we can put in place, and right now we have tools available to train every healthcare worker on the planet. And that is something that we look forward to working with all of our member states through our regional offices to do this training so that they can be better prepared to protect themselves against infection and provide the best care that they can for all patients with COVID-19.
Just one thing I would like to say. Countries who, relatively have the strongest health system have been actually surprised by this pandemic. It shows that any system could have gaps, and we should have the humility to see to what extent our system is prepared and where are the gaps and how can we improve it for the future. I think from this pandemic we have to try to learn, focus on learning where the gaps are. This is not a message only for the developing world. This is a message even for the developed countries. Across the board, you see the preparedness of the public health system and, of course, the whole health system. And that's why WHO has been advocating for universal health coverage, health for all, strong health systems, with a strong foundation of primary health care. And within that, strong preparedness, especially in public health, prevent outbreaks. That's the best, actually, the best option. And if it happens, we diagnose early and respond quickly and address it as quickly as possible. But we can see now, with this pandemic, there is a serious challenge for vulnerability even in countries who claim to have the strongest health system. I think this should be to all our members and see and assess the situation carefully, understand the gaps carefully, and understand the importance of health. We should not go into the cycle of panic and neglect. As you all know, we are now in a phase of panic. Because there is this dangerous, invisible virus which is creating havoc, and there is panic, and there is that should actually lead into asking questions on what to do to strengthen our system and to improve or reduce the vulnerabilities that we have. So the risk which is coming to our health professionals is because of weak health system. The reason why we're not detecting or preventing the outbreak easily or quickly is because of weak health system, because of serious vulnerability. And I don't think there is, from what we have seen now, no country is immune. No country can claim that it has a strong public health system or a strong health system. So we have to really be honest and assess and address this problem to provide better services to our people, but at the same time to protect our health professionals too.
Thank you very much. Next question comes from Brazil, Ana Pinto. Ms. Pinto, can you hear us?
Oh, yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
I can hear. Can you hear? Okay. Fine. Yeah. So it seems there seems to be a lack of coordination in some countries in terms of data collection and also lack of transparency when informing figures. In Brazil, for instance, studies have been indicating that numbers may be underreported. I would like to know if WHO is tracking those problems, and if so, what can be said about the quality of data in Brazil? And since quality data is crucial to formulate the right policies, what could be done to tackle underreporting data in such countries in the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I think all countries around the world have experienced some difficulties in coordination, and particularly at subnational level, particularly in large countries with federated states. And there have been issues, obviously, between countries, especially neighbouring countries, in trying to work together to coordinate and align their activities. In fact, that's been a feature of this response, is that trying to get that international alignment, regional alignment, national alignment, subnational alignment of all of the activities with all of the actors and the players involved, in that sense, has been a huge challenge to governance at every level. I've often been asked, what are the most important things in epidemic response, and people expect me to say diagnostics or epidemiologists, and I usually say three things: governance, governance, and governance. I mean, at the heart of epidemic or emergency response is a need for coherence, for coordination, for alignment, for compromise. And sometimes compromise with people whom you might never compromise in any other circumstance. A partnership with people you might never work with in any other circumstance, because the goal goes higher. The goal is to go beyond the differences, to put aside differences and work together. That is difficult to do, but in a true emergency, that is what we all do. And I think that's something that all countries have experienced at one level or another. Some are overcoming that more successfully than others. But it is something that must be done if we're to get to the end of this epidemic. In terms of numbers, and I think sometimes we say, well, there's a lack of numbers or a lack of transparency. I think the first thing in all countries we need to recognise is that frontline health systems are under huge pressure, and therefore reporting data isn't necessarily their first priority. If I'm a doctor or a nurse on the front line, I really don't think I've done a bad job if I save a life and I haven't filled in the form. And therefore, we have to give local systems a break. We have to empower them to be able to report. But we shouldn't necessarily when they don't, and it's the same. We need to make sure there's enough data to make a proper assessment of the situation. If there are large gaps geographically, if there are large gaps in certain communities, if there are gaps around certain vulnerable communities, and that's a vacuum, then that's just harping on the daily numbers. It's very important. We need to look at each of the data. Are we gathering enough data on the clinical disease? Are we gathering enough data on mortality? Are we missing large pockets of death? Are we missing large pockets of death? Is there something else we need in order to have a better response? If the answer to that is yes, then you have a data problem. But But if it's or you got it wrong yesterday by 2 deaths, and these become political games that are fire between different groups. I think we have to be very, very careful to not do that. So we need to regularly review the data we're using to drive the response at each level. And if that data is either not being collected or not being sent, we have to fix that problem. But we don't need every single piece of data at every level to manage outbreaks. In fact, you need less data at higher levels. You need the most data at the local level. You need less data at the national level, and even less data at the international level. In fact, data can be your worst enemy in some cases, because you can become overloaded with data and become information poor. You're data rich, information poor, if you don't know what to do with that data. So it's a complex issue. Countries need to focus on collecting the data they need, and more importantly, using that data, putting it to good use, and using that data to drive the response. With regard to cohesion at country level, it is a huge test. Epidemics are a stress test to our system. They stress every component of our society. And governance is tested in the same way as the social systems are tested, as the health systems are tested. And in many ways, and in some ways, all our systems are being found wanting. And all need a level of repair and renewal. We need to go about doing that as we go through this pandemic as well.
And if I could just add to that, so there's different types of data that's collected. We talked a lot about the case-based data that comes from countries, but there's other types of data collection that comes through studies, that comes through epidemiologic studies, through clinical studies, through laboratory investigations, through treatment studies, through looking at how many lab tests are actually done and what it is to seroepidemiologic data, to anthropological data, through social science data. And as I said, we don't need this in every single country at all times. If there are some locations that aren't as well as other countries, if they can do a well-characterized study looking at healthcare worker infections, for example, who could look at disease severity, who could look at infection in children, these pieces of information from these well-characterized and conducted studies could really help inform the response. Helping us look at how we're doing the right things. How do we need to tailor this approach based on what we learn about underlying conditions, treatment options? How do we prevent people from progressing to severe disease? So there are countries that could carry out these studies, and they are. And these studies are ongoing. This is why we are constantly looking at the pre-publication papers that are coming to us through the journals, that are coming to us directly from scientists, and constantly looking at the papers that are being published, because all of that, in addition to us talking to clinicians and social scientists and laboratorians, all of that feeds into our guidance materials, into the advice that we're providing to all member states.
Thank you very much. The next question from NHK. Shoko, can you hear us?
Hi, Tarek. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I think my question is this is about Japan. Since the first confirmed case was reported in the beginning of January in Japan, the number of newly confirmed cases were quite stable for about 2 months. But since the beginning of April, we see a rapid increase of confirmed cases. How do you analyze the situation in Japan and perhaps other countries' nation while the center of the pandemic is still in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, I think Japan, in fact, we had some very excellent data from Japan on their approach over the last number of months. And Japan has done a very, very good job over months, and it's taken an approach of very systematic investigation of clusters. In fact, I think they call many of their teams cluster busters. They have these very specialized teams that have been going out and investigating clusters. And not only have they been able to contain those clusters, but they've gained a lot of tremendously useful information on how the disease spreads.
That is Dr.
So, for
Michael
example,
Ryan of the World Health Organization, following on from his boss, Dr. Tedros, briefing on the latest in the coronavirus pandemic, saying that we are now in the phase of panic because there is this dangerous invisible virus which is wreaking havoc, but we must strengthen health systems, he said. No country is immune, no country can claim it has a strong health system, and says that while there has been a much needed slowing of coronavirus cases in major European countries, there are alarming rises elsewhere. And the WHO is warning nations against the hasty lifting of restrictions.
I know that some countries are already planning the transition out of stay-at-home restrictions. WHO wants to see restrictions lifted as much as anyone. At the same time, lifting restrictions too quickly could lead to a deadly resurgence. The way down can be as dangerous as the way up if not managed properly.
That's Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. Let's speak now to Kimberly Halkett, who's been listening in. She's standing by in Washington, D.C. And Kimberly, keep those lockdowns going is the message.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that for the second time this week, we have heard from the World Health Organization chief not mentioning U.S. President Donald Trump by name, but clearly in that soundbite he just played, that was the message intended at least for the leader of the United States, who has continually, in the face of contradictory messages from his public health officials that people need to stay indoors, has continued to cheerlead and talk about the possibility of reopening the economy. I think it's also important to note, given the fact that the U.S. president this week doubled down on his lashing out against the World Health Organization, particularly that it's too China-centric, that it was slow to declare a global health emergency, that the Dr. Tedros there has essentially spoken to each one of those criticisms, but at the same time taken the moral high ground in terms of not getting into the tit-for-tat escalation of the U.S. president coming from the White House. It is important to note in all of this that there was a call from the chief there that the G20, which the United States, of course, is a member of, that they need to be stepping up their contributions in terms particularly of the personal protection that is needed, he said, for about 30% of the world, that they will be reliant on the WHO to distribute through the World Food Program supply chains, that they will need this type of equipment, because this speaks directly to the fact that the U.S. president has, in fact, threatened to cut U.S. funding. And this is notable given the fact the U.S. is the World Health Organization's biggest donor, contributing at least 50% of the budget.
10% of health workers are infected worldwide, and said that was an alarming trend.
Trend that includes the United States, and I think that's one of the things that we really tried to underscore. The U.S. president continues to what's being said by U.S. city mayors, that there is a shortage of personal protective equipment, that it's not getting out to the states. The U.S. president is saying just the opposite. So we heard there again, Dr. Tedros speaking there directly, countering the points of the U.S. president, speaking from a global perspective, saying that not only is there an alarming shortage, but that no country is immune in terms of its public health system, that there is no strong public health system, and that would include the United States. So again, the U.S. president running for re-election, trying to put a positive face on a crisis that has gripped this country and is accounting for almost a third of the world's cases, that things are going to turn the corner and do so rather quickly. But that's not the message we got there from the head of the World Health Organization.
All right, Kimberly, leave it there for the moment. More later with you. Look forward to that. For the time being, thanks very much, Kimberly Halkett there in Washington, D.C. The spread of coronavirus in New York is slow, despite the state reporting more cases than any country outside the United States. The number of new hospital admissions statewide has been rebounded. It's fast approaching 500,000 than in New York. Mass burials are taking place as morgues run out of space. More than 16,000 people died worldwide, and that is second now to Italy. Right, energy ministers from the world's largest 20 economies are holding an emergency meeting on how to protect oil markets damaged by the fallout from the coronavirus crisis. Their video conference follows a record-breaking deal by OPEC and its allies to cut production to try and boost prices. And that's failed to happen so far, and prices have sunk even further, reducing output by 10 million barrels a day, also owing to the country's unprecedented collapse in demand caused by the coronavirus. Well, earlier I spoke to Jeff Colgan, who's a professor of political science at Brown University, also author of Petro-Aggression, When Oil Causes War. And he says it's unrealistic to believe the OPEC deal will stabilize overnight.
Oil markets have actually fallen on news of the deal as opposed to rising as OPEC Plus had hoped that it would happen. They were looking for a boost of up to $15 a barrel. And in fact, prices are going into reverse. And that's striking because I think there's really two things that are happening because of what's happening here. One is that while the deal does contain some substantive cuts, most of what's being announced are so-called market cuts, meaning the kinds of things that are going to happen, deal or no deal. These are decisions made by individual producers reacting to the change in market conditions that are, ramping down because of lower oil prices. So in some sense, this is more hype than real substance. And the second thing that matters for the prices is the fact that there is a persistent overhang in supply, right? So the expected shortfall in demand over the next 2 months is something like 25 to 30 million barrels a day. And this deal is 10 to 15 million barrels a day. So it only goes part of the way to addressing the massive demand shock. We're continuing to see oversupply, and that's going to drive prices likely downwards as inventories continue to build. It is significant in the sense that Saudi Arabia and a few of the Gulf monarchies are changing their strategy to a certain degree. But much of what's happening here, as I said, is market cuts. It's going to happen anyway, especially in the United States.
Yemen has announced its first recorded case of coronavirus in the eastern region of Hadramaut. A curfew has been imposed and markets and mosques ordered to close. As the war in Yemen enters its 6th year, many fear hospitals won't be able to cope with an outbreak. Laura Bird Manley.
Streets deserted. A 12-hour curfew imposed. It's a moment many feared. Yemen's first reported case of COVID-19 in the southeastern port city of Al-Shahab. Yemeni medical officials in Hadramaut region have tweeted that the person is in a stable condition in hospital. Healthcare workers know how dangerous the virus is in a country where half of all facilities have been destroyed by 5 years of war.
We're with the governor of Hadramaut to inspect the patient's examination and diagnosis at the fever hospital in Fuluk. This centre is established and ready to receive as many patients as necessary.
The World Health Organization says it's assessing who may have been exposed to the virus. And the charity Save the Children says there are 700 intensive care unit beds, including 60 for children and 500 ventilators, for a population of about 30 million people. Confirmation of the virus came at the start of a 2-week unilateral ceasefire brought by the Saudi-UAE-led coalition. It says the pause in fighting is to help stop the spread of the coronavirus. But a Houthi spokesman told Al Jazeera they consider the ceasefire announcement a media and political stunt and want a comprehensive UN-led deal.
We were very clear before the corona pandemic. We wanted the war to stop completely until the siege was fully lifted. The siege makes Yemen too weak to fight the pandemic. We didn't say that the ceasefire is rejected, but we expressed doubts about the intentions of the Saudis, who've proved that they haven't committed themselves to their unilaterally announced truce.
Analysts believe the Saudis and the Emiratis are looking for a face-saving way out of a war they can't win. The pause in fighting in Yemen started as the United Nations Security Council held an emergency closed-door meeting via video conference. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says he wants to work towards a ceasefire in all conflicts during the pandemic. Many fear in a country where millions face famine and lack access to clean water, it's impossible to follow simple rules to prevent the spread of the infection. Laura Bowden-Manley, Al Jazeera.
To South Africa now, and it's extended its lockdown until the end of the month. The government says some gains have been made in slowing down the spread of COVID-19, but there is widespread concern about the impact the crisis is having on the already struggling economy and what that means for millions of jobs. Famida Miller is in Johannesburg and reports on what that means for millions of jobless.
The richest square mile in Africa ground to a halt. While the Johannesburg Stock Exchange continues to operate, not much else does. South Africa is 2 weeks into a lockdown to contain the spread of the coronavirus. And while progress is being made in fighting the disease, the economic impact is devastating for millions of South Africans. This is one of dozens of businesses in Johannesburg that's had to close its doors. Owner Abdullah Mia says customer numbers were down by more than 90%, even before the lockdown started. He says recovery will take a long time.
The reality is that, we've literally come to a complete standstill. So our expenses are 100% what they were, but our income is zero. So it's had an extremely strong impact on us, because effectively you now can't get your reserves.
South Africa's central bank says the lockdown has so far led to the economy contracting by 2.6%. It estimates that more than 300,000 jobs will be lost. 1,500 small businesses won't survive. But economists believe that estimate is far too low, and the number of unemployed will be in the millions.
During the global we had 1.5% of GDP drop, and we lost 1 million jobs. Now, what we're seeing now is 6 times worse than what happened during the global financial crisis. Frankly, consider what is going to happen to our economy over the next 18 months.
President Cyril Ramaphosa says while the government's priority is to save lives, it also has to save the economy from collapse. The Unemployment Insurance Fund has set aside $2 billion for jobless people. Tens of millions of dollars will be spent on small business debt relief, and hundreds of millions more on helping small farmers. The president says ending the lockdown too soon or abruptly could risk a massive and uncontrollable resurgence of COVID-19. But as millions stay home to be safe, many worry about how they'll pay their bills, their businesses will survive, and just how long South Africa will take to resuscitate its already ailing economy. Famida Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg.
Well, the world's 4th most populous nation is enforcing stricter safety after a surge in coronavirus cases. Public transport is reduced to half capacity, and gatherings are banned in Indonesia. The new rules are in place for 2 weeks in the country of 270 million people. Jessica Washington is in the capital, Jakarta, and she says there's growing public concern about a lack of testing.
This isn't quite a lockdown, but these do indicate that China is on its way to some sort of partial lockdown. Now, these restrictions on gatherings of more than 5 people and on reducing public transport services do indicate that the local government here in the capital city is taking this crisis very seriously. Now, some of these measures, like school closures, like office closures, have been in place, but now we have these strict penalties for those who are breaching these social distancing measures. Fines of around $7,000 for people who are still gathering in large groups. Now, across other regions of poverty in Indonesia, restrictions are different. But what is similar across all of these provinces is that every area needs to seek permission from the central government if they want to enact similar social distancing measures. That may, of course, slow down the responses of particular provinces. Now, Indonesia only confirmed its first cases of the coronavirus in March. By that point, the virus had already spread well beyond China, and many people were growing very suspicious as to why Indonesia had not even confirmed a single case, considering we're one of the world's most populous nations, a population of 270 million. The other problem is, of course, the testing. Now, we've had at least 3,000 confirmed cases of the virus and 300 deaths, but Indonesia does have one of the world's lowest rates of testing, so perhaps the crisis is on a much bigger scale than we realize.
For the first time in weeks, no new cases have been reported in the South Korean city of Daegu, at the heart of the country's coronavirus outbreak. The number of new infections across the country continues to decline. Just 27 cases were confirmed in the past 24 hours. South Korea has reported more than 10,000 cases so far. More than half are in Daegu. 50 crew on board the French Navy have been diagnosed with the virus. The Charles de Gaulle has cut short its mission to space in the Mediterranean port of Toulon. Parts of the aircraft carrier are shut down and the 1,700 crew ordered to wear masks. 980 people have died in the United Kingdom in the last 24 hours due to COVID-19. It is the highest since the outbreak began. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who's standing in for the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, is urging people to stay indoors this Easter weekend as the weather warms up. Raab is warning people to stick to the government's lockdown rules. Jonah Hull has more now from London.
The Easter weekend now, a time when people want to be with their families, extended families and friends and so on. If there was ever going to be a moment of lockdown fatigue, one imagines this might be it. And the government, of course, the message, as you heard it there from Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, Mr Johnson's effective stand-in is please don't restrictions, stay at home as much as you can, come out to exercise once a day by all means, but no sunbathing, no picnicking in the parks. And behind me, this park is a pretty good example of very disciplined self-distancing going on, really not very crowded at all. That may not be the case around the country. We've heard in the last 24 hours from Sir Patrick Vallance, the scientific advisor, also Paul Cosford, the medical director of Public Health England, both pointing to a flattening of the transmission rate, the rate of infections, an apparent flattening over recent days, also reductions in the ICU admission rate. 2 weeks ago, that was doubling every 3 days. It's now doubling every 6 or more. And they point to these two metrics, if you like, as evidence that the lockdown really is having an effect. The death toll is extremely high still. The latest death toll, 866 people died in the last 24 hours, registered as having died in UK hospitals. But they say those, or at least many of them, will have contracted COVID-19 before the lockdown came in place. So don't be put off by those figures, they say. And indeed, the high death toll may continue for another couple of weeks before the lag effect kicks in. But overall, the message is the lockdown is working. Please, please stick to it.
A Good Friday service has been held in Notre Dame Cathedral after the devastating fire in the French capital 12 months ago. Only 7 people attended the ceremony in Paris because of the coronavirus lockdown. The service was broadcast nationwide as Christians around the world celebrate Easter. In France, an orchestra is turning the tables by taking its music to health workers and their patients. With theatres closed because of the lockdowns, the Bordeaux Opera is performing at hospitals and old people's homes. The musicians are also showing their support for the healthcare system while sticking to strict social distancing rules, of course. Don't forget our website, aljazeera.com is the address. Plenty of comment and analysis right there, aljazeera.com. This is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories, and the World Health Organization says while there has been a much-needed slowing down of the coronavirus cases in major European countries, there are alarming rises elsewhere. The WHO is warning nations against the hasty lifting of restrictions, saying no country is immune.
The reason why we're not detecting or preventing the outbreak easily or quickly is because of weaker system, because of serious vulnerability. And I don't think there is, from what we have seen, no country is immune. No country can claim that it has a strong public health system or a strong health system.
The fight to spread of coronavirus in New York is slowing, but the state reporting more cases than any country outside the United States. The number of new hospital admissions statewide has been trending downwards. The US has passed a record of 500,000 infections. But in New York, mass burials are taking place as morgues run out of space. More than 16,000 people have died nationwide in the second round of this week. Energy ministers from the world's largest 20 economies are holding an emergency meeting of oil markets damaged by the fallout. Their video conference follows a record-breaking deal by OPEC and its allies to cut production to try to boost prices. That's failed to happen so far, and prices have sunk even further. Reducing output by 10 million barrels a day is also aimed at countering the unprecedented 50 crew on board the flagship of the French Navy have been diagnosed with the virus. Short its mission to return to base in the port of Toulon. 180 people have died in the United Kingdom in the last 24 hours. It's the highest since the outbreak began. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who's standing in for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, is urging people to stay indoors this Easter weekend as the weather warms up. Raab is warning people to stick to the government's lockdown rules. Those are the headlines. Got more news here on Al Jazeera after Mike Hail de Guevara, the wedding planner. Bye for now.
Mi Cuba es mi familia, es mi trabajo, son mis proyectos. Mi Cuba es el único lugar donde consigo la vida. Mi Cuba es toda esta maravilla. Mi nombre es Ailede Guevara, soy creadora de fiesta. Pequeña, y la idea era resaltar la belleza de lo que era el Navarro. Decidimos usar este diseño que nunca habíamos usado aquí. Así me gusta. Construirlo más. No lo pongas hasta que no esté puesto el otro, a ver cómo luce mejor. Yo no tenía la intención, nunca tuve la intención de crear este proyecto, o sea, no surgió con la idea de hacer fiestas ni bodas, fue simplemente un proyecto familiar. Mi hermano decidió casarse, mi cuñada, después de dar vueltas por toda La Habana, no lograba encontrar nada que le gustara, y casi en broma yo le dije, yo te hago, la verdad. Llamamos, compramos un montón de cosas y terminó siendo un evento súper lindo. A partir de ahí, el hotel donde hicimos la boda nos pidió colaboración para algunos otros proyectos. Y así se en lo que yo llevo, que yo me demoro más que él, y llegar aquí también. Yo renuncio a veces a muchos espacios de mi vida personal. Trato de tener, cuando estoy sobresaturada de trabajo, después trato de dedicarle un espacio a mi esposo, a mi familia. Eso también es un punto ahí para compensarme, él también trabaja mucho. Entonces, a veces soy yo la que le está yendo la mano, a veces él. muchas veces tengo que renunciar a hacer cosas con ellos por poder materializar esas ideas. Creo que todo fue el momento adecuado. Y coincide que en el país en este momento abrieron una serie de actividades económicas, licencias para cuentas propistas y la actividad de bodas y decoración estaba incluida en ellas y así sufre PDP. Nuestros clientes fundamentalmente hoy nos encuentran a través de las redes sociales y generalmente son cubanos que no viven en Cuba y vienen a Cuba a casarse o a realizar su evento porque tienen aquí parte de su familia.
Ese es el estilo que queríamos explorar. Los blancos es muy rústico. Son los mismos, lo que pasa es que la independencia es de la fotografía. Pero te llaman. No, no te preocupes, te llaman, eso es lo que tienes ahora. Sí, ya. Consiguiendo grandes. Consiguiendo grandes. Una hora, el gran feo. ¿Dónde está? Ilian.
Mi equipo es fundamental para poder tener el resultado que tenemos. Me paso la vida exigiendo muchísimo de ellos, pero cada vez que puedo reconozco que a pesar de todas las ideas, de toda la creatividad, de todos los recursos del mundo, si no tienes un personal formado, con sentido de pertenencia, si no tienes esa diferencia en el trato, sin eso no podríamos sería y eso ya no es la primera vez que pasa. Llaman al almacén, oye, me entregaste 8, me entregaste de 14, pero si tú tienes una lista, si ustedes llegan por una casualidad y no hay nadie del almacén, me tienen que llamar a mí. Sí es cierto que a veces buscar recursos es complicado con las condiciones que todo el mundo sabe que existen en Cuba, pero no es algo que se puede lograr. O sea, se puede lograr con un poquito de creatividad, es ver cómo se sustituye un material por otro muchas veces. Y también está de todo. Muchas cosas a veces se pueden fabricar aquí. Mi familia es una familia muy unida. Mi abuela logró aglutinarnos a todos. Mi mamá ha asumido todo ese papel. O sea, estemos cerca o hay momentos en que podemos estar muy lejos, pero sin embargo vivimos pendientes unos de otros.
Mami, atiéndeme. A mí me hace falta que cuando ustedes lleguen me vayan a comprar velitas. Estuve haciendo cuentas y nada más que me queda para una semana. Pero eso no me alcanza, nene. Me hace falta que regrese hasta la tienda. Dale, gracias. Bueno, dale, mamá, te quiero mucho. Cómprame vela. Chao.
Al final, entonces, nos vemos. Ahora lo que yo quiero hacer es con la tela subir lo más posible a este punto, porque las telas son tan anchas que no podemos hacer nada, tienen que ser 2 tubos que se unan aquí en el centro.
llegando 2 máquinas nuevas que adquirimos, que nos permiten hacer unos calados un poco más sofisticados, por decirlo así. Aunque las máquinas hacen su parte, después todo esto pasa por las manos de cada uno.
Me gustaría un cierre sencillo, como tipo que pueda terminar así, en una bolita, algo bonito, inventa otra cosa, pero no que cierre así, en un círculo, que diga menú. Cuando tengas el prototipo, ¿cuándo lo podemos volver a ver? ¿Mañana tempranito o esta tarde?
Si puedes hacer esta tarde, mejor.
Si lo puedes hacer esta tarde, mejor.
Yo soy el responsable de que cuando ella pide las compras, irlas a comprar y enviar. Departamento de compra y envío, lo tenemos ahí. El departamento de compra y envío es un departamento sin fines de lucro, solamente de gasto. Es muy importante aclarar eso.
Mi hermano, mándame vela.
Con mucho placer. Con mucho placer.
Bueno, bebecito, bien.
Después de un año llevo diciéndole por 15 veces no me llames el día anterior para decirme que necesitas 200 velas. No importa, lo sigue llamando el día anterior y seguiremos comprando las 200. Eso no es.
Y entonces yo le llamo y le digo, ay, mijito, muchas gracias por ayudarnos, hermano.
Mira, tírase la mamá. A ver, mamá. Mamá,
Tienes un nivel de autoexigencia muy alto y te hace trabajar como descomunalmente.
Es verdad.
Eso fue.
Eso es verdad. O yo sé que se va a conformar hasta aquí y yo trabajo 5 horas más por lograr otra cosa. Aparte de lo que sea, sí. Bueno, que...
Sí, yo se lo dije que es de la escuela.
El evento del 16 es una boda diamante, que es el nivel máximo de decoración que vendemos hasta el momento, que lleva un trabajo muy grande a nivel de producción, mucha tela en el techo para cubrir el mismo del Hotel Nacional, que es bastante difícil y bastante amplio. Maravilloso, me ve súper bien. Aile nos lleva a nosotros a hacer cosas que, a mí, por ejemplo, me ha llevado a hacer cosas que yo pensé que nunca iba a poder hacer. Para Aile el límite es el cielo y yo creo que se pasa un poquito.
¿Qué tal, señorita?
Bueno, rejita no tanto. Mejor. Ahí, las puertas las vamos a dejar aquí porque las vamos a usar sin las puertas. Vamos a usar solamente la estructura del mapa. Gente, por aquí van a entrar los novios, la novia.
¿No te gusta ponerle las puertas como si las estuvieras abriendo?
No. No me hace falta que las puertas estén abiertas porque yo voy a colgar cosas, pero si sirven para estabilidad, si no las llevamos.
O tiene que ser recta para atrás o recta para adelante.
No, es que el peso es el peso.
Recta, no tan recta. Recta, sí, inclinadita, un poquito.
Ocho, 9, 10, 11. Y nos falta una mesa que la carpintería no nos está haciendo. boda del 16, la complejidad está en el alto nivel que tiene la boda. Es decir, en la exquisitez de la decoración que tiene y el tema de toda la estructura de telas y que se van a poner, forrar y demás. Es decir, es lo más complejo que tenemos, que por eso la vamos a estar montando desde días antes para poder que todo esté en tiempo en el evento. Y Ailé, siempre con todos nosotros, es trabajo, pero siempre es parte de una familia. Por eso siempre hay ese compromiso entre nosotros, de fiesta y Ailé.
No me preocupa tanto como la mesa de ella, la distribución, que ahora tenemos que ir probando ahí ideas para la distribución de la mesa de ella. Me preocupa el tiempo que tenemos para montaje.
Hola, mucho gusto. Nayara.
La expectativa del equipo es muy grande con tu boda. Porque es la verdad la primera diamante que tenemos. Queríamos enseñarte. Mostrarte primero el diseño finalmente que escogimos, que queremos que te dé bien para tus hijos.
Okay.
Ya las mesas las viste.
Sí, ya las vi.
Eso es falta de sorpresa, no podemos enseñarlas más porque es así. El techo va a estar cubierto de 2 capas de tela. Se ve porque la tela es transparente, pero con el tema de la iluminación, todas esas cosas después cambian.
Ok, pues sí.
Yeah.
Me gusta la idea.
La idea es que no vamos a cubrir 100% las rejas porque el gaseo es bonito. No queremos ocultarla completa.
No me gusta esa cantidad de aluminio que
No sé qué es eso que te estoy diciendo. Se va a ver que es reja, no se te va a ver. Vamos a ver, no se va a ver. Lo otro es cubrirlas con telas y sobre eso trabajar. ¿Te quedas tranquila?
Gracias.
Se quedan más tranquilos. Y yo también.
Para bodas es un trabajo que es estresante porque tiene que estar todo muy bien calculado porque la boda es una vez, un día. O sea que si no sale hoy no tienes la oportunidad de repetirlo mañana. Tiene que ser hoy. Lo de Nayara es que vamos a hacer una ceremonia completamente distinta con un gran volumen de flores. Te vas a dar cuenta que el 90% de la ceremonia va a ser floristería.
Esta es mi pobre suegra, que vino a ayudarme porque tuve aquí un problema de emergencia y que tengo que hacer los remates a la tela que ya está montada. Así que la fui a buscar a su casa y la trasladé con máquina y todo. Una boda donde nada más que es glamour, elegancia, chic, todos los materiales de primera, o sea, esto es cristal, o sea, todo es de lujo. Creo que sobre las 5 o 6 de la mañana. Quizás estamos terminando la primera fase del salón. escalera vacía. ¿Por qué tú estás poniendo cinta? ¿Quién te lo dijo? Ok, entonces, no quiero a nadie fuera del lugar. Y se trata de que esto no quede así. De que coja el mismo, ¿entiendes? No aquí abajo. Llevamos aquí, o sea, ayer fuimos solo a la casa una hora a ducharnos y regresamos. Pero no me puedo ir hoy hasta que no apruebe algunas otras cositas. Y si me puedo ir, será más o menos sobre las 3, 4 de la mañana, calculo.
Ahí estamos igual.
No sé ni qué hora es. Hola, buenas tardes. Oh, quería saber si ha cambiado en algo el pronóstico de lluvia.
¿Para hoy?
Para esta tarde.
No, se mantiene la lluvia hasta el anochecer.
Okay, por favor. Yo tengo un evento en los jardines del Hotel Nacional. ¿Usted más o menos tiene idea a qué hora va a llover? Lo que
Bueno, al menos por el radar debe ser después de las 2 de la tarde.
Después de las 2 de la tarde. Y la situación debe mejorar a partir de qué hora.
Bueno, ayer se extendió hasta las 7, 8 de la noche. Y hoy las condiciones están muy similares a las de ayer.
¿A qué hora yo puedo, por favor, volver a llamar y tener un parte más actualizado?
Sobre las 3.
Sobre las 3.
Okay. Sí, cómo no.
Muchas gracias, mi amor.
No hay de qué, que tenga buen día.
La que no llueva. Que no llueva. Pues 95% de probabilidades de lluvia a partir de las 12 del día, es lo que está diciendo el parte ahora mismo. Está bajando a 23 a las 3 de la tarde.
Este país yo lo amo, mi Habana la amo, tengo a mi mamá, tengo a mi abuela, tengo toda mi familia y no podría haberme casado en otro lugar que no fuera en Cuba. Así que pienso que vaya a ir todo bien.
You told everybody to be downstairs 4:45. Lorenzo, Jamie, and
You said this thing starts at 5. ¿Usted todavía está consciente de quererse casar? Yo conocí a mi mujer aquí, somos cubanos, entonces para mí parece que era justo venir aquí a Cuba a casarme aquí, sino a mi padre cubano.
¿Quitaste las guías de cinta que habíamos puesto? Bueno, hasta el final vamos a intentar mantenerle la ceremonia allá afuera. A lo mejor tenemos que montar un poquitico más tarde, porque dice que sobre las 6, 7 de la noche ya debe estar mejorando el tiempo, pero nosotros tenemos que necesitar al menos una hora de montaje. Los papeles, ¿cómo vas? ¿Cuántos papeles tienes que cambiar? Aquí hay que cambiarlo. Este se fue completo, este está desbaratado. Todos los papeles estos están desbaratados. Déjame ir a ver la mesa presidencial. No, pero para hoy, que es la boda a las 6 de la tarde, pronóstico de lluvia en este momento, ¿cuál es, por favor? No, si es nublado nada más, no importa, hacemos fiesta. Bueno. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego, la web va a llamar. Gracias, mi amable. Y la onda tropical se debilitó. Nublado, Licey, le puedes decir a Nayara.
acompañada con su mamá. She's coming with her mom.
Buen trabajo. Thank you.
¿Te gustó? Ay, cómo sufriste. Y otros días sin dormir. ¡Qué cosa tan bella! Estoy feliz. No lo puedo creer. Esto es mío.
Agradezco mucho a la vida todo lo que me ha dado, todo lo que aprendí. Hay cosas muy pequeñas que me dan mucha felicidad. Yo necesito grandes cosas para ser feliz. Necesito estar rodeada de las personas que quiero, eso sí, de las personas cercanas, de las personas que quiero. Mi Cuba es mi Habana, mi mundo, es mi equipo, es mi proyecto. Mi Cuba es la mitad del único lugar donde yo soy yo, es mío. Ese es mi Cuba.
We understand the differences and similarities of cultures across the world. So no matter how you take it, we'll bring you the news and current affairs that matter to you.
Crossing borders, breaking boundaries, recording injustice, fighting inequality. From Africa and Asia to Europe.
I use exile as a power, mine poverty. Everywhere I go, Guinea is one country.
Al Jazeera World meets 4 refugees who've come to Europe, changed people's lives and made a difference. A hard road back photographers and activists on Al Jazeera.
Russia has jeopardized the United States security interests.
We know what you are doing, and you will not succeed.
Perceptions from outside. But what's the
I think Russia's foreign policy is too soft.
What Russian goals can we achieve? None. Peace and war. The view from Russia on Al Jazeera.
Lifting restrictions too quickly could lead to a deadly resurgence.
A warning from the World Health Organization as governments look for ways out of coronavirus lockdowns. Coming out. Economies try to finalize a deal aimed at boosting oil prices. Also, Yemen records its first case of coronavirus, leading to fears for how we cope. Fighting back, we look at what the US are doing to combat the effects of the disease. So the World Health Organization has warned governments holding back restrictions aimed at containing coronavirus. The rate of infection has been slowing in some countries. Others are seeing an alarming surge.
Some countries are already planning the transition out of stay-at-home restrictions. WHO wants to see restrictions lifted as much as anyone. At the same time, lifting restrictions too quickly could lead to a deadly resurgence. The way down can be as dangerous as the way up if not managed properly.
Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Harford in Washington, D.C. And Kimberly, the message is keep those lockdowns going.
Keep those lockdowns going, even as the U.S. president has considered lifting some of those restrictions in the face and contradicting public health officials here in the U.S. who say it's important to keep those stay-at-home restrictions. The World Health Organization chief there, for the second time this week, taking a moral high ground, refusing to engage in the kind of tit-for-tat we saw from President Trump, and continued to point the finger at the World Health Organization this week, accusing it of being too sensitive, not sort of notifying, slow to declare a public health emergency across the planet. We saw there from the chief of the World Health Organization instead speaking almost directly to the United States, as you heard there in that soundbite, saying that it would be a mistake to lift those restrictions too early, that this could lead to a dangerous resurgence. He also spoke to the ongoing issue of a shortage of personal protective equipment around the world and also in the United States, saying that this is in fact an alarming revelation, one that needs to be addressed.
We're particularly concerned by the large number of infections reported among health workers. In some countries, there are reports of up to 10% of health workers being infected. This is an alarming trend. When health workers are at risk, we're all at risk.
Now, the World Health Organization announcing that it's going to use its World Food Program chains to address this shortfall that could be as high as 30% of the countries that are at risk of not having the proper equipment. They are already using funds that are in existence to help move some of this, but urging donors to contribute more. This is notable, again, given the fact that the U.S. president once again doubled down on his threat to withhold funding, U.S. funding, to the World Health Organization. This is significant given the fact that the United States contributes about 15% of that budget and is the organization's biggest donor.
I know you're going to stay around because we will be speaking to you about this, which is the scene at the White House right now. We're awaiting President Donald Trump to give his briefing. It normally takes place at 21 GMT, which is about 4 hours from now. But it's coming early today, this Easter Good Friday. He's there alongside Anthony Fauci, his coronavirus task force man and Vice President Mike Pence. Staying in the United States, are assigned to spread of coronavirus in New York is slowing, despite the state reporting more cases than any country outside of the United States. The number of new hospital admissions statewide has been trending downwards. The US is fast approaching 500,000 infections. And in New York, mass burials will take place, even more run out of space. More than 16,000 people died nationwide, that is second now to Italy. Energy ministers from the world's largest 20 economies are holding an emergency meeting on how to protect oil markets damaged from the fallout from the coronavirus crisis. Their video conference follows a record-breaking deal by OPEC and its allies to cut production to try to boost prices. Reducing output by 10 million barrels a day is also aimed at Earlier, I spoke to Jeff Colgan, who's a professor of political science at Brown University, author of Petro-Aggression When Oil Causes War, and he says it's unrealistic to believe the OPEC deal will stabilize the oil market overnight.
Oil markets have actually fallen on news of the deal as opposed to rising as OPEC had hoped that it would happen. They were looking for a boost of up to $15 a barrel, and in fact, prices are going into reverse. And that's striking because I think there's really two things that are happening because of what's happening here. One is that while the deal does contain some substantive cuts, most of what's being announced are so-called market cuts, meaning that these are the kinds of things that are going to happen, deal or no deal. These are decisions made by individual producers reacting to the change in market conditions that are, ramping down because of lower prices. So in some sense, this is more hype than real substance. And the second thing that matters for prices is the fact that there is a persistent overhang in supply. Right? So the expected shortfall in demand over the next 2 months is something like 25 to 30 million barrels a day, and this deal is 10 to 15 million barrels a day. So it only goes part of the way to addressing that massive demand shock. We're continuing to see oversupply, and that's going to drive prices likely downwards as inventories continue to build. It is significant in the sense that Saudi Arabia and a few of the Gulf monarchies are changing their strategy to a certain degree. But much of what's happening here, as I said, is market cuts. This was going to happen anyway, especially in the United States.
Yemen has announced its first recorded case of coronavirus in the eastern region of Hadramaut. A curfew has been imposed and markets and mosques ordered to close. As the war in Yemen enters its 6th year, many fear hospitals will not be able to cope with an outbreak. Laura Bird-Manley has this report.
Streets deserted, a 12-hour curfew imposed. It's a moment many fear. Yemen's first reported case of COVID-19 in the southeastern port city of Al-Shahr. Yemeni medical officials in Hadramaut region have tweeted that the person is in a stable condition in hospital. Healthcare workers know how dangerous the virus is in a country where half of all facilities have been destroyed by 5 years of war.
We're with the governor of Hadramaut to inspect the patient's examination and diagnosis at the fever hospital in Bullock. This centre has been established and ready to receive as many patients as necessary.
The World Health Organization says it's assessing who may have been exposed to the virus. And the charity Save the Children says there are 700 intensive care unit beds, including 60 for children and 500 ventilators, for a population of about 30 million people. Confirmation of the virus came at the start of a 2-week unilateral ceasefire called by the Saudi-UAE-led coalition. It says the pause in fighting is to help stop the spread of the coronavirus. But a Houthi spokesman told Al Jazeera they consider the ceasefire announcement a media and political stunt and want a comprehensive UN-led deal.
We were very clear before the corona pandemic. We wanted the war to stop completely and the siege to be fully lifted. The siege makes Yemen too weak to fight the pandemic. We didn't say that the ceasefire is rejected, but we expressed doubts about the intentions of the Saudis, who've proved that they haven't committed themselves to their unilaterally announced truce.
Analysts believe the Saudis and the Emiratis are looking for a face-saving way out of a war they can't win. The pause in fighting in Yemen started as the United Nations Security Council held an emergency closed-door meeting via video conference. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says he wants to work towards a ceasefire in all countries during the pandemic. Many fear in a country where millions face famine and lack access to clean water, it's impossible to follow simple rules to prevent the spread of the infection. Laura Bird-Manley, Al Jazeera.
Efforts to eradicate Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo have suffered a setback. The World Health Organization had planned to declare the outbreak over on Monday, but had to call off the announcement after a new case was discovered. The 20-month-long epidemic has killed more than 2,000 people. Still ahead here on Al Jazeera, European leaders agree on a rescue plan to help countries hit hard by the pandemic. We'll have the details. Plus, Indonesia cranks down, imposing a series of restrictions after a surge in coronavirus infections.
quite hot, quite quickly in some parts of the Arabian Peninsula, Qatar in particular, where the forecasts are 39 or even 40s, accompanied by quite a stiff southerly breeze out of the empty quarter. That's usually a dusty or a sandy one. And it's all in contrast to much lower temperatures from the eastern Med inwards. Look at this, Jerusalem at 14, for example, and that coolish weather comes right down into northern Saudi with a less strong breeze, but still probably a dusty breeze. A result of yet another system which is progressing eastwards, taking rain into Iran. The following breeze then will bring a few showers in all the way from northern Egypt right up to southern Turkey. Not an unusual thing, just maybe a little bit disappointing. By the time we get to Sunday, I think the showers are mostly gone. The temperatures will start to rise. The breeze is less strong. The temperature has dropped in Doha to 33, and the same is true in Riyadh as more of a northerly breeze gets in rather than that rather stiff and hot southerly. For North Africa, the breeze is still quite strong, though you can't see it from the satellite picture. But here it is, running down through Egypt and Sudan. That's taken the temperatures down in Khartoum, for example, and all the way down through this Sahel. There are a few showers to the south of that. Of course, you'd expect them. Nigeria is a good case in point, and so indeed is Cameroon, with thunderstorms for the next 3 days.
There we go, you're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. And the World Health Organization is warning against lifting virus restrictions quickly, saying it could be a steady resurgence of the outbreak. The head of the agency also expressed concern over reports of up to 10% of health workers being infected with COVID-19 in some countries. G20 energy ministers are holding a virtual meeting to finalise details to protect global oil markets by the outbreak. Their video conference follows a record-breaking deal by OPEC to cut oil by 10 million barrels a day to try and combat global prices. Yemen has announced the first recorded case of coronavirus in the city of Al-Shar in the eastern region of Hadramaut. The port has been closed for a week along with Now, the world's fourth most populous nation is enforcing stricter social distancing after a sudden surge in coronavirus cases. Public transport has been reduced to half capacity and gatherings are banned in Indonesia. The new rules are in place for 2 weeks in the country of more than 270 million people. Jessica Washington is in the capital, Jakarta, and she says there's growing public concern about a lack of testing.
This isn't quite a lockdown, but these do indicate that Jakarta is on its way to some sort of partial lockdown. Now, these restrictions on gatherings of more than 5 people and on reducing public transport services do indicate that the local government here in the capital city is taking this crisis very seriously. Now, some of these measures, like school closures, like office closures, have been in place, but now we have these strict penalties for those who are breaching these social distancing measures. Fines of around $7,000 for people who are still gathering in large groups. Now, across other regencies and provinces in Indonesia, the restrictions are different. But what is similar across all of these provinces is that every area needs to seek permission from the central government if they want to enact similar social distancing measures. That may also slow down the responses of particular provinces. Now, Indonesia only confirmed its first case of the coronavirus in March. By that point, the virus had already spread well beyond China, and many people were growing very suspicious as to why Indonesia had not even confirmed a single case, considering we're one of the world's most populous nations, a population of 270 million. The other problem is, of course, the testing. Now, we've had at least 3,000 confirmed cases of the virus and 300 deaths, but Indonesia does have one of the world's lowest rates of testing, so perhaps the crisis is on a much bigger scale than we realise.
Well, let's take a closer look at the impact the virus is having on Indonesia, why the government is enforcing tougher measures. This is the Johns Hopkins tracker, and it shows what's going on around the world as far as coronavirus is concerned. You can see up there on the top left the total number of cases, 1 million. The total number of deaths, fast approaching 100,000. And there you see the list of countries topped by the United States, approaching 500,000 deaths, 500,000 cases there, I should say. And as you scroll down, a long way down, 37 last count, which is extraordinary for a country of 274 million people, you'll find Indonesia. Now, there it is, a total number of 3,512 cases, and total number of deaths, just 306. Let's examine that further. We can speak to David Alexander, who's Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London. David, those numbers, as I say, for a country of 274 million, seem extraordinarily small. What's your view?
Well, it rather depends where Indonesia is in the cycle of the disease. It may be simply at the start of it, where something happened instantaneously. And in fact, Indonesia may be facing a case where there is a proliferation of the disease, and that really is a challenge. Some years ago, an Indonesian cabinet minister said to me that disasters were their top priority in government. Let's hope that's still true, but this is a very different disaster than the kind that they normally deal with, which are somewhat regionalised within the country. This is potentially something that the entire country will have to deal with.
Right, and that is a problem, isn't it, in the sense that there could be cases all over the country, but knowing about them is the issue.
Well, I think that's true, not merely for Indonesia, but for any country. But it is particularly true and particularly worrisome for countries that are densely populated and have very large populations in relatively small spaces.
How capable is Indonesia of handling what could be a large outbreak?
Well, they have a great deal of expertise in disasters in general, and disasters cause an enormous amount of disruption in Indonesia. In fact, they're almost weekly events, and I'm talking there about volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, landslides, and so on. Unfortunately, countries are rather different. They are facing a situation that they probably haven't faced in any great degree before. They have had regional food shortages and regional epidemics and outbreaks of disease, for example, in floodable areas of North Jakarta. However, I don't think we've ever faced anything quite like this during the history of the Northern country.
Right, and now we're learning that stricter restrictions will be in place. Will there be enough, and will it be possible to enforce social distancing in the way that it needs to be?
Well, these are the questions that are faced by every country, United Kingdom, United States, wherever, and they are just as much faced by Indonesia. Jakarta is an enormously highly populated city. It is absolutely vast, and it is extremely densely populated. It takes an enormous amount of time simply to drive across Jakarta as a city. And I think there is plenty of scope for the transmission of the disease. We will simply have to see whether the measures are effective at cordoning it and stopping it from proliferating. If not, then there will have to be more stringent measures. We'll have to see whether those work, but there really is no other choice.
Right, and what about across the region? How are neighbouring countries?
Well, again, I think they all face similar sorts of problems. We will have to see how the disease performs in tropical environments as well. The Philippines, for example, is another country that is well versed in dealing with disaster. But once again, the disasters it usually has to deal with, which include up to 30 major tropical storms a year, tend to be very regional within the country, more so than COVID would be, and of course of a rather different nature. So we'll have to see how well they're capable of adapting their structures for dealing with disaster to what comes next. And we also have to worry about countries like Nigeria, which is equally very, very populous. It has a very good structure for managing diseases, except that when you get to the local level, it tends to thin out rather drastically. So we'll see how Nigeria copes with that.
And we'll just have to hope that somehow the worst of the pandemic passes these by. David Alexander, we do appreciate your time.
If I may, particularly a second wave. If we look at the 1918-1920 influenza pandemic, the second wave was worse. Most of the deaths were in developing countries. Nobody knows how many. In fact, the estimates differ by 100%.
We appreciate your expertise, Mr. Alexander. Thanks very much for that. Thank you. Cases being reported in the South Korean city of Daegu, at the heart of the country's coronavirus outbreak. The number of new infections across the country continues to decline. Just 27 cases were confirmed in the past 24 hours, while South Korea has reported more than 10,000 cases so far. More than half are in Daegu. Well, South Korea is the first major country to hold a general election during the COVID-19 crisis. President Moon Jae-in cast his ballot while suitably protected. He's been praised for getting one of the world's worst outbreaks under control, and that's helped his Democratic Party of Korea regain support following an economic slowdown, corruption scandals, and tensions in North Korea. Today, after he was beginning to get back to work, President Jair Bolsonaro has appeared in public in the international gatherings and social distancing. In a video posted by one of his sons, in the capital, posed with photographs with some who removed their protective mask. His visit also prompted others to gather outside as it downplayed the pandemic. European Union finance ministers have agreed to a $590 billion rescue package aimed at propping up economies devastated by the coronavirus crisis. It includes a short-term employment scheme which aims to prevent millions of workers from losing their jobs. Funds are also available in loans to member states which need help with healthcare, virus cure and prevention costs. But the ministers couldn't agree on shared borrowing and postponed talks on how to fund long-term economic recovery. Dominic Kane has been following developments from Berlin, and he says the EU deal may have been agreed on in principle, but the details are still being debated.
Italy and Spain really want to see the EU front up with guarantees for their debt called Euro bonds, or in the current crisis, Corona bonds. Effectively, having Germans, other North European countries guaranteeing their debts so that they then can concentrate their economies on fighting Corona. That has not happened. And in some ways, it's probably never going to happen right now, because there is resistance from the Germans, the Finns, the Dutch and the Austrians, all really balking at the idea of providing this blank check. At least that's how it's portrayed by several important business types in Germany. They don't want to see that happen. So what's there is solidarity. They have sympathy for the Southern Europeans. They're being told that you can have fast loans. You don't have to repay them right now. And there's money that will help your employers keep their staff on the payroll without them going to the wall right now. But this is temporary assistance. It's not something that the EU can keep paying long into next year. This is not what's on the table right now.
The number of coronavirus-related deaths in the United Kingdom has risen to almost 9,000, by nearly 1,000 on the previous year. The Health Secretary says it's vital that people respect lockdown.
It's a time of year when people normally come together, but however warm the weather, however tempting the local beach or park, we need everyone to stay at home. Because in hospitals across the country, NHS staff are battling day and night to keep desperately sick people breathing. And they need you to stay at home.
Well, Jonah Hull has been to London parks to see if people are still.
Here we are, almost 3 weeks now into the UK, particularly
restrictive lockdown measures introduced by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson on March 23rd, just before he went ill. It's the Easter weekend, of course, lovely sunny spring weather, and if ever lockdown fatigue were going to set in, we might expect that it would happen now. I'm in a London park in which social distancing looks to be practiced pretty sensibly. Perhaps not the same picture in every park across the country as the sunny weekend progresses, but the message from the government is very simple. Doing keep these measures up. They exercise only once a day, no picnicking, no sunshine. And we heard in the last 24 hours from Balance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Dr. Paul Cosford, Medical Director of Public Health England, both pointing to two very important metrics at the moment. The rate of transmission, the rate of infection seems to be plateauing. It's not going up as it was. And the rate of hospital admissions, ICU admissions, seem to be coming down. Just 2 weeks ago, those were doubling every 3 days. They're now doubling every 6 or more days. And both of these metrics, they say, are evidence that the lockdown is working. The death toll is still terrifyingly high. They point out that these numbers are largely people who would have contracted the virus before the lockdown came into place. And as long as these measures are kept in place, as long as the lockdown is rigidly observed, and it may well be extended next week, they would expect to see those numbers begin to fall within the next couple of weeks.
Well, small business owners across the United States are trying out new methods to help them survive the virus. Some are turning to the internet rather than waiting on Congress to decide whether to free up $250 billion to help keep them afloat. Rosalind Jordan has this.
Even before the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a state of emergency in Virginia, forcing non-essential businesses to close. The owners of Honest Soul Yoga were moving their classes online.
Making that initial choice to right away start filming things, right away start streaming things, has helped our team stay positive with this, and it has helped us generate a lot of content that we can share and continue to interact.
Never fight to achieve something ends, but to develop.
A few days down, a martial arts studio turned to video to keep its students on track.
Both hands.
Master instructor Rizal Dumadog says not being hands-on, relying on extra help.
Our parents and our families have been very, very resilient and creative in ways in which they train. And in fact, parents are even more inclined to practice the techniques with them. So they do, in a sense, get some sense of sparring and practice in there.
Dumadog and Lopez are concerned. The rent, utilities, and paychecks are still due.
Even though our studios are essentially running dark right now, that doesn't mean those payments go away or are completely eliminated. We're still responsible to make sure that we can do our very best to have some business for people to come back to.
The pandemic is also challenging arts organizations to rethink how they engage with visitors and the broader community. Right now, the only way to experience the Boca Raton Museum of Art in Florida is to visit its online exhibitions or take a virtual class.
What this is causing us to do is to rethink our entire practice and the presentation that we make to the public. What is our role? What is the role of art in society? We have to make an even more compelling case than we ever have before. And the mantra has to be, creativity has not been canceled.
All of us, we have no idea how this is going to end, when this is going to end. So just keep supporting each other, uplifting each other, and checking in with people, your neighbors.
Big breath in for one.
A deep breath and deep trust that people will support the businesses and organizations that enrich their lives now and after the pandemic is over.
Chamber, hook it out.
Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So this is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories. And the World Health Organization has warned governments against prematurely rolling back restrictions aimed at containing the coronavirus pandemic. It says that while the rate of infection has been slowing in some countries, others are seeing an alarming surge in cases.
I know that some countries are already planning the transition out of stay-at-home restrictions. WHO wants to see restrictions lifted as much as anyone. At the same time, lifting restrictions too quickly could lead to a deadly resurgence. The way down can be as dangerous as the way up if not managed properly.
G20 energy ministers are holding a virtual meeting to finalize details to protect global oil markets damaged by the COVID-19 outbreak. Their video conference follows a record-breaking deal by OPEC to cut oil output by 10 million barrels a day to try to boost global prices. Yemen has announced its first recorded case of coronavirus. The infection is in the city of Al-Shar in the eastern region of Hadramaut. The port has been closed for a week, along with markets and mosques there. There are signs the spread of coronavirus in New York is slowing, despite the state reporting more cases than any country outside the United States. The number of new hospital admissions statewide has been trending downwards. The US is fast approaching 500,000 infections, and in New York, mass burials are taking place as morgues run out of space. The world's fourth most populous nation is enforcing stricter social distancing after a sudden surge in coronavirus cases. Public transport has been reduced to half capacity and gatherings are banned in Indonesia. The new rules are in place for 2 weeks in the country of more than 270 million people. Just end this bulletin with pictures from the White House. That is the briefing room there, where we will expect Donald Trump, the president, to come out and give his daily briefing on the coronavirus, and we'll be joining that just as soon as he does. More news coming up right after Inside Story. Goodbye for now.
Will record-breaking cuts in production be enough to stop the oil price slump? Crude producers led by Saudi Arabia and Russia agree to the biggest ever reduction in oil for sale. So who will be most affected? This is Inside Story.
It's down to 60,415. That's down from the 82,000 shown on Tuesday. Well, New York State alone has more confirmed cases than any other country, with more than 200,000. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put out new guidelines for essential workers.
If they're asymptomatic, as the Vice President said, they could go back to work if they do several things, as we say here. Take their temperature before they go to work, wear a face mask at all times, and practice social distancing when they're at work.
Meanwhile, Europe is also seeing signs of a potential slowdown, but its models show the death toll will surge to 151,000 deaths. During the first wave of the pandemic, scientists are predicting that this wave will end on August 4th. At the top of that list is the United Kingdom. The country reported 939 fatalities on Wednesday alone. That brings the total death toll to more than 7,000. Spokesman for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Johnson's condition continues to improve. This is after his third night in intensive care. Well, Italy could be easing some of its stringent lockdown restrictions by the end of April, while Spain reported 683 deaths in the past 24 hours. This is a lower number compared to the previous 2 days, but still with more than 152,000 infections. Meanwhile, Russia surpassed 10,000 cases. President Vladimir Putin announced an extension of a non-working week for the country until April 30th. In Iran, the country's health ministry reported 117 more deaths, bringing the death toll up to more than 4,100. The country's supreme leader suggested a ban on mass gatherings. This is right before Ramadan is set to begin later this month.
Logically, we are going to be deprived of public gatherings for the month of Ramadan. Those gatherings are meetings for praying to God or listening to speeches which are really valuable. In the absence of these meetings, remember to heed your prayers and devotions in your lonesomeness.
For more numbers and information on the coronavirus, be sure to check out our Portable.tv app and look for the section tracking coronavirus. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and Allied oil producers. They held a virtual meeting seeking to find a solution to the plunging oil prices. But can all of the key players make a deal that will actually last? Well, for more, we are joined by RT correspondent Rachel Blevins and Boomba's co-host Christy I. Rachel, let's start with you. What happened during their Thursday meeting?
Well, Sarah, the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia appears to have reached a ceasefire, as two of the world's largest oil producers agreed to a historic deal. This, according to reports that Saudi Arabia agreed to remove 4 million barrels per day from its April production levels, while Russia agreed to cut 2 million. The deal was made during a virtual meeting between OPEC members and other allied oil producers amid a need to respond to the drop in demand from the ongoing lockdown over the coronavirus pandemic. As a result, global oil demand has dropped by an estimated 30%, resulting in a push to decrease the market's oil supply by around 20 million barrels per day. This tentative agreement would lead to cuts of 10 million barrels per day until June, with the numbers tapering off in the following months. While Russia and Saudi Arabia have indicated their willingness to cut oil production, they have also said that a deal would depend on whether the U.S. agrees to join. But despite ongoing talks with the Saudis and support for other countries being required to reduce production, the Trump administration has fought back against placing limits on U.S. oil, insisting that production is already falling on its own. In a statement, the U.S. Energy Department said, quote, with regards to media reports that OPEC Plus will require the United States to cut in order to come to an agreement, the EIA report demonstrates that there are already projected cuts of 2 million barrels per day without any intervention from the federal government. Meanwhile, oil prices were up ahead of the meeting Thursday, with the global benchmark Brent crude oil futures up 3.9% at over $34 per barrel, and the U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate up 5.9% at over $26 per barrel. This deal comes weeks after a breakdown in talks over production cuts between Russia and Saudi Arabia that resulted in a price war and increase in production, which sent oil prices falling to their lowest point in 18 years. Now, Sarah, it still remains to be seen if Washington's participation is going to be a sticking point in all of this to coming to a final deal, and if all of these top oil producers are going to be able to come together to bring stability to the markets as this coronavirus lockdown continues.
Well, thank you, Rachel. A lot still unknown over that. But Christy, what is this doing to global markets?
Well, earlier this morning, as Rachel said, oil jumped as much as 12% on the reports that Saudi Arabia and Russia had reached some sort of a deal on these deep output cuts, with some sources citing that a number could be as high as 20 million barrels per day. However, that pop was faded as investors awaited confirmation and additional details to be released, such as how the cuts will be divided among the OPEC Plus countries and how long will they be in place for. Many are skeptical that these cuts are not as large as they're being touted to be. The street had been expecting something in the range of between 10 to 15 million barrels per day. So, by purposely overshooting expectations, the oil cartel intended to boost sentiment and rally the prices in the short term. But in the long term, though, many analysts think that they've shot themselves in the foot for promising something that is not achievable. So, I mean, that sounds familiar to a lot of people, right? It sounds exactly like President Trump purposely overshooting expectations on China ag trade purchases earlier this year with the $50 billion mark. Well, now traders didn't have to wait long at all for the pop to be faded, as oil prices turned negative on the latest meeting to tape. That cuts of only 8.5 million barrels per day were agreed to between Russia and Saudi Arabia, lasting only through the months of May and June. Once again, it's a buy the rumor, sell the news, with oil trading down over 6% to end the day. Equities, however, rose on optimism that the curve is flattening, wrapping up its best week since 2008, after the Fed gave more details on how they will support the economy amid the coronavirus pandemic. The indexes rose 1% to end the week, up 12% on the S&P, as the U.S. markets will be closed tomorrow in observance of Good Friday. Now, the rally had been attributed to a ginormous bear squeeze to get stocks out of the oversold territory. Fiscal policy had also assisted sentiment, though it will be difficult to get when the duration and impact of the COVID-19 is still unknown. Weekly jump claims have jumped by 6.6 million, which means that 16 million Americans, that's almost 10% of the workforce, have now lost their jobs in the last 3 weeks. The largest increase has come from California, Michigan, and New York. Now, in order to tackle the mounting problems facing the economy, the Fed announced plans to inject an additional $2.3 trillion into businesses in order to backstop the U.S. economy. The central banks also revealed plans to buy corporate bonds both at an investment grade level as well as a high yield or junk bonds. Now, think about that for a second. 2 weeks ago, it was merely investment grade bonds, but now it has expanded to reach junk bonds as well. So the question remains, when will stocks and equities come into play, similar to what Japan is doing? Now, that would really be the last nail in the coffin for the free market.
Well, Boombust co-host Christy I and RT correspondent Rachel Blevins, thank you for that report. On Thursday, the U.S. Department of Labor announced, like Christy said, another 6.6 million Americans that filed for unemployment. Altogether, about 16.8 million people have now filed unemployment claims for benefits in just the last 3 weeks. Now, those are record numbers we're talking about here, record lows, the lowest since the Great Depression when 8.6 million people lost their jobs. But that, however, was in a matter of 2 years. Well, let's bring in CEO and Chief Strategist Quill Intelligence, former Federal Reserve insider, Danielle DiMartino Booth. Danielle, thank you for joining us today. I want to look at
having me.
And start with the unemployment. Now, we're looking at a loss of about 10% of the workforce in just the last 3 weeks. JP Morgan saying that it could go as high as 7 million. Now, will it?
I think that we will indeed see a fourth subsequent wave, a fourth subsequent week, because if you look at the most populous states in the nation, we're talking about Florida, New York, California, especially Texas. Texas has a huge backlog of unemployment insurance. The servers are simply overloaded. Georgia's come up in terms of states that are locking down after the East Coast and after the West Coast lockdown. Same situation with Florida. The unemployment insurance system simply cannot keep up. And we know that as a portion of the labor force that these large states have a much lower percentage that are actually collecting unemployment insurance. In other words, the next 2 weeks, we're going to see waves continuing to come through as these claims are processed. So yes, I think that 17 million, 10% of Americans, 1 in every 10 workers. I think we need to consider that still, unfortunately and sadly and tragically, a starting point.
But let me ask you this. When it comes to the small business loan that is being offered to these small businesses, they've already laid off people. We're not seeing the rehiring process yet because they still have to submit applications into the bank, right? So how bad is this actually going to get? I mean, these are numbers that are worse than the Great Depression.
They are worse than the Great Depression, and sadly, we think that we live in the information age. But the communication from the administration, the communication from the Small Business Administration, has clearly been convoluted. We've had to do piecemeal band-aids on the small business lending throughout the entire week. And now you've got the legal community up in arms because such a large preponderance of small businesses in America have independent contractors, self-employed. They don't qualify to apply for these loans. So you've got also a backlog of people who have no choice but to lay off their workers because they're not W-2 employees. So look, the work is cut out. It seems like the Federal Reserve is doing everything possible for the largest employers in the country and for investors on Wall Street. But 1 week later, after the rollout of this SBA program, you've still got way too many small businesses left behind.
Now, I want to move on to the International Monetary Fund. They're scheduled to meet next week for their they're taking them virtual, their spring meetings. But head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, said that the pandemic is turning global economic growth sharply negative, that the world is facing a worse economic fallout since the Great Depression, that if the pandemic doesn't ease after June, it could be much, much worse, and we could only see a partial recovery in 2021. That's still, 7 months from now, 8-9 months from now. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think what we're learning, especially if we look at the microcosm of the Deep South in the United States, is that COVID-19 is not necessarily weather agnostic. It's not necessarily going to be less contagious just because the warmer weather is setting in. And to the IMF's point, that has tremendous implications for the emerging markets, for Africa, for India, for countries with much, much less in the way of healthcare infrastructure and the way that it could pull down the global economy. I heard one estimate this morning that said that estimates right now where COVID-19 is are at 195 million people losing their jobs worldwide. And again, this is under the assumption that we're going to be able to flatten the curve and that COVID-19 responds to warmer weather. We're not sure of that. We just know that it's only been around since mid-November. We can't draw any conclusions just yet.
Especially if it's going to be cyclical. But the IMF did double its lending capacity to $100 billion. But who knows whether or not that will even be enough. But I want to move on to the Federal Reserve. We talked about it. You mentioned it earlier. They announced plans to inject another $2.3 billion into business and revenue-pinched government. Christy mentioned it earlier today. Is this going to happen? Just a quick 30-second answer, if you will.
I think the Fed is definitely willing to do whatever it takes. They've shown that. They've crossed that red line in the sand into junk bonds and shown that they're willing to bail out investors. So, I jokingly tweeted out earlier today, somebody said, when are they going to be buying stocks? And I said, check back next Thursday morning before the jobless claims reports come out. They might be buying stocks by then.
And they could be lending to individual companies is what their next step could be, essentially, from what we're hearing. But former Fed insider Danielle DiMartino Booth, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Time now for a quick break, but hang here because when we return, we'll continue the conversation of unemployment and what it means for gig workers like Uber and taxi drivers. As we go to break, here are the numbers at the close.
The world is driven by dreamers, shaped by thinkers and those with vision.
Who dares, thinks. We dare to ask.
I don't trust medical authority at all, ever. And the reason for that is I had this horrible autoimmune disorder growing up, and it turns out it was completely alleviated with very drastic dietary measures. And I went to a number of doctors to discuss what happened to me, and I was basically laughed at, like diet has nothing to do with autoimmune disorders. So my suggestion to people who have health issues they can't figure out, if they're going to see a medical professional and they've been going for 10 years and they're still in the same place, they should probably take it upon themselves, start testing things out, testing out diet, testing out exercise, and try and figure out things on their own.
Before the break, we spoke to Danielle DiMartino Booth. I want to clear that up. The Federal Reserve is injecting $2.3 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars into these small businesses. But moving on to the coronavirus pandemic, it's driving up unemployment numbers in the United States to heights not seen since the Great Depression. We discussed that earlier. But even as the numbers skyrocket, companies like Uber are looking to pass new laws that will allow them to keep treating employees like contractors with only partial benefits. Well, legal journalist Molly Barrows has more on this effort and the pushback it's getting. Molly, good to see you. Let's start with Uber, who's now proposing something like this, correct?
Yeah, so this is their baby. The CEO wrote a letter to the president saying, hey, you know, and he's got this spin on it essentially that says we want to treat our workers evenly. They should have access to some of the same unemployment benefits that full-time employees, if you will, are considered. And that's the gist of what I got out of, what he was trying to say. But he basically wants to have a legal definition that redefines really employment so that he can validate the business model that he has now, which is essentially using these workers as part-time employees, if you will, with only access to partial benefits. They're contract workers is what they're called. and he wants to basically make that official, if you will, in a legal sense. And so it's getting a lot of pushback from a group of about 50 labor groups, including Gig Workers Rising, Legal Aid Society, to name a few. And they're urging lawmakers not to listen to this, Sarah. They're saying, look, they've already misclassified these employees as contract workers. And as a result, they were living paycheck to paycheck, and they've been hit among some of those that have been hit the hardest by this coronavirus pandemic. So they're urging lawmakers, again, not to listen, and are even saying, we're rather appalled that any of these ride-sharing services would even propose a law like this. But it's an issue that's going on across the country, and it's similar to a bill, or actually a ballot referendum that's trying to make it onto the ballot in California to have voters vote on something very similar to what Uber is suggesting to the president. They're suggesting to the voters of California in answer to a law that was recently passed in California that made it harder to define these contract workers as that sort of, in between the cracks employee that only gets partial benefits. They're trying to make it so these companies have to pay more benefits.
Well, and what about the broader aspect of this, the more general, looking at the gig workers, like cab drivers, for example, in New York City, they're union workers. How are they surviving during this pandemic?
There's a couple of great articles that are out there talking about what these cab drivers are going through from California to New York to Washington, D.C., like you mentioned. I mean, it's beautiful weather outside in many parts of the country. This is the time of year when you would have spring breakers, although sadly Governor DeSantis did not close the beaches of Florida. But, it's a big business booster in this time of year, whether you're going to see the cherry blossoms in D.C. or taking a trip to a big city like New York or San Francisco. And so these hotels are empty. People aren't traveling, whether it's a cab driver, an Uber driver, a ride-sharing driver, a hotel worker, restaurant staff. They're all losing money, and a lot of these folks were living paycheck to paycheck, and they don't have the options to fall back. Many of them with those unemployment benefits that perhaps a legally defined full-time employee would have. So, they are struggling. They're relying on savings, what little they have, also credit card debt. And again, this is a reason why these labor groups are saying now is not the time to try to legally redefine what employment is. We need to be having these companies that are benefiting from this flexible contractor work model be the ones that are pouring money and not the taxpayer into these increased unemployment benefits like you're seeing with the stimulus package and the money that the federal government is pushing towards helping people in these difficult times. And they're saying these corporations that are benefiting from this flexible contractor business model should be the ones helping as well.
A lot of sectors that we've talked about, manufacturing, technology, it seems like nearly every sector that we're looking at has been hit pretty hard by this coronavirus. Molly Barrows, contributor with America's Lawyer, thank you so much for your time.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you.
White House advisor Jared Kushner has reportedly a task force that's reached out to a range of health technology companies about creating a national coronavirus surveillance system. Well, the goal of this system, according to Politico, is to give the government a near real-time view of where patients are seeking treatment and for what, and whether hospitals can accommodate them. Well, according to 4 people with knowledge of the discussions. But what does this mean for privacy and civil liberties? Well, joining us now to discuss is Boomba's co-host and investigative journalist, Ben Swann. Ben, more privacy concerns possibly here. What do we know about this database?
Yeah, first of all, to give you an idea of how intrusive this database may be, a lot of people with knowledge about it are referring to it, Sarah, as the Patriot Act for healthcare. That is how intrusive this would be. It would actually be a database that has been compiled from private data companies, gathering information on people, where they are, when they go to the hospital, what they're seeking treatment for, how many hospital beds are available, and it would basically comprise a massive database in order to track the coronavirus. And again, listen, the coronavirus is a serious issue. The economy is facing a lot from it. People are facing a lot. But at this point, it has not been proven to be this deadly plague wiping out the world. So the idea that we would invade into massive areas of surveillance in order to prevent it from continuing in the future just seems a little outlandish.
A little outlandish, to say the least. But are there issues here that go beyond just privacy?
Yeah, there actually are issues. So you have the privacy issue, which obviously is a huge concern for a lot of people when it comes to civil liberties. And remember, when we talk about privacy, healthcare privacy, federal law and state laws, there are so many laws surrounding healthcare privacy right now that creating a gigantic database with everyone's medical information in it just seems like it's ripe for hacking, and how it could even be legal doesn't even make sense. But beyond that, you also have a lot of companies that are reaching out to the administration to help be a part of this because there's big money in this process. We're talking about probably hundreds of billions of dollars worth of contracts that would be awarded to companies to pull all these databases together. Remember what we just saw with the Pentagon and Amazon, that $10 billion deal for the JEDI contract for cloud computing. Well, this would be an even larger contract probably. So you have a lot of private companies getting in that. And so it reeks of cronyism and these companies that will profit off building databases to track you and me and our health information.
Well, and not just that, but now some healthcare professionals are also voicing their concerns about this type of network, right? Why is that?
Well, they are. And one of the reasons that they are is because, again, health care information is extremely sensitive. So when you start talking about using private companies to build databases, for-profit companies to put this all together, working with the government to track and surveil people, and to put together these lists of their healthcare information, it reeks of many of the trappings that healthcare workers warn about all the time. The sensitivity of that information, can it get out? If it gets into the wrong hands, what can be done with it? And also, again, how are people tracked from that? You know, what's fascinating about this corona situation right now is how much bad information keeps coming out, even within those databases. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're seeing, I know we got to wrap here, but we're seeing so many issues with pneumonia cases. Suddenly, coronavirus is responsible for every pneumonia-related death in the country, when in years past, the numbers suddenly this year for pneumonia would be way down and coronavirus way up. So there's a lot of problems with collecting data and properly analyzing that.
Well, not just that, but I want to ask you one more question, Ben. As far as universal testing, how much of consumer confidence will that actually help when it comes to universal testing? A lot of people calling for it, saying that's the only way to end this pandemic. What's your take on that?
Well, look, there is a lot of talk about universal testing right now. The question becomes, number one, are the tests accurate? And number two, what does it mean if you test positive for coronavirus? Does that mean that you are now going to walk around with an ankle bracelet on? Does it mean you'll be monitored everywhere you go? Because that's happening right now in Kentucky. There's a judge in Kentucky who has people walking around with electronic ankle bracelets on because they have coronavirus, so that the state knows where they are, because that goes into a whole other level of surveillance.
A whole nother level, like you said, especially if 50 or 20%, whatever that number is, of people are walking around asymptomatic. That's even more dangerous. Boombust co-host Ben Swann, thank you so much.
Sarah, thanks.
Well, that's it for this time, but you can catch Boombust on demand on the brand new Portable TV app, available on smartphones through Google Play and the Apple App Store by searching portable.tv, or stream us to your TV by downloading the Portable TV app on Apple TV and online at portable.tv. As always, check us out on youtube.com/BoombustRT. We'll see you next time.
So much that we really don't need. That's what this whole lockdown is teaching so many millions of people, that most of their lives were wasted on stuff that's unnecessary, costly, redundant, and doesn't promote social good at all.
With the coronavirus now officially declared a pandemic, the world faces the additional burden of an oil market collapse. This comes at a time when demand for crude was already low. Some are calling this the ultimate perfect storm. How this all ends is anybody's guess.
there, I'm Manila Chan. You're watching In Question, broadcasting live from RT America National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. We want to welcome our viewers from across the nation and all around the world. Here are your top stories today. First, chaos as the coronavirus outbreak is now taking over several prisons nationwide, with protesters rallying to release the inmates. A full report next. Plus, Australian MPs are calling for Julian Assange to be released from prison and instead be subjected to home detention as COVID-19 spreads inside Belmarsh prison. Then over to the International Space Station, where the latest space crew to arrive talks about what's happening right here on Earth with the global pandemic. All right, it's time to boost News IQ. COVID-19 continues to grip the world and this nation. The total now topping 1.6 million people with 98,000 deaths and 365,000 recovered cases. Now, the U.S. still leading the way with some 473,000 confirmed cases and about 17,000 deaths and about 26,000 recovered. And as the number of infections continue to surge, prisons and jails across the country have become hotbeds for this virus. But while some are looking to free up space, others are seeing protests over a lack of action. RT's Rachel Blevins is joining us now live from the newsroom with more details to this. Rachel?
Well, Manila, the United States is known for having the largest prison population in the world, and hundreds of thousands of inmates are now calling for help as both prisoners and guards test positive for the coronavirus. Dozens of inmates took part in a demonstration at the Monroe Correctional Complex in Washington State after 6 prisoners and 5 staff members were diagnosed with the virus. While officials confirmed that officers used pepper spray and rubber bullets to try to control the protesters, they claim no one was harmed. A nonprofit law firm filed a motion calling for the state Supreme Court to issue an order that would mandate tests for all prisoners and push for the release of inmates with underlying health conditions. Now, in response to the outcry, state officials said they have separated the inmates who tested positive and they are looking into early release for nonviolent drug offenders who are nearing the end of their sentences. A similar demonstration was held at the Lansing Correctional Facility in Kansas, only this one was more violent. Around 20 inmates took part in an hours-long riot Thursday night. Officials said they destroyed property, including breaking windows and setting small fires. So far, 12 inmates and 14 staff members at the jail have tested positive for COVID-19. Concerns over the rampant spread of the coronavirus are being felt at prisons across the country, with the close quarters between inmates and staff leaving many to worry that it is impossible to escape an infection. Like in Vermont, where after one prisoner tested positive, the Northwest State Correctional Facility conducted 328 tests on all available inmates and staff. So far, at least 28 inmates and 5 staff members tested positive. Reports noted that most inmates were asymptomatic. And in Chicago, at least 2 inmates at the Cook County Jail have died from complications related to the coronavirus. Right now, 276 prisoners have tested positive for the virus at a facility known as one of the largest single-site prisons in the country. The crisis has drawn the attention of Attorney General William Barr, who issued a memo calling on the federal prisons in Danbury, Connecticut, Oakland, Louisiana, and Elkton, Ohio, to release inmates classified as vulnerable in an effort to lessen the impact of the coronavirus. His directive comes after 7 inmates died in Oakdale, and so far more than 500 inmates from the facilities have been moved to home confinement. Meanwhile, inmates at the Fort Bend County Jail in Texas are now devoting their time to sewing masks to protect themselves and the essential staff members with supplies the jail purchases from local businesses. The facility currently has 0 confirmed cases, and they say their goal is to keep it that way. Now, it still remains to be seen just how much of an impact COVID-19 will have on prisons across the country, but many are hoping it will push facilities to release nonviolent offenders and drastically reduce the overall prison population before it is too late. Reporting in the newsroom, Rachel Blevins, RT.
The Australian Parliament have called on British officials and the judge to release Julian Assange due to the rapid spread of coronavirus among the prison population and the workers at Belmarsh Prison, where Assange is being held 23 and a half hours a day in a solitary confinement cell. Last night, journalist Vaughn Smith said Assange contacted him and shared some more insight into what's really happening at Belmarsh, contradictory to what little the tight-lipped prison officials are saying. Joining in on this conversation now, former UK MP and friend of Julian Assange, George Galloway. So, George, Julian told Mr. Smith that the Prison Governors Association is considering releasing more than 15,000 nonviolent prisoners. The Department of Justice is considering some 4,000 people, but Julian is not on any of those lists, even though the Aussie Parliament is now calling for his release on humanitarian terms, maybe suggesting home arrest with an ankle monitor. To all of this, you say what?
Well, there's no argument against this. It's incredible that it is not even on the table for discussion, never mind agreement. He could have a tag on. He could go to a nominated address. They could stick 2 cops on an 8-hour shift, 3 shifts. It'll still cost them much less than it's costing them to keep him in Belmarsh. There literally is no logical argument against that. And as he told our friend Vaughn Smith from the Frontline Club, one of Britain's eminent journalists, although he himself does not yet have coronavirus, he's surrounded by people who do. And he exercises for 30 minutes just a day. That's all the time that he's out of his cell. He's surrounded by hundreds of other prisoners, many of whom undoubtedly have got this virus. So it comes back to the point that I've been making. If Julian Assange, an unconvicted man, cannot be released to home detention when hardened, convicted criminals are, this is a level of discrimination and bias that can only lead you ineluctably to conclude that they want Julian to get coronavirus 19. They want Julian to die. They want, I say on Good Friday, to wash their hands of this troublesome priest. It's a very, very ugly story, Manila.
Yeah, George, this is just incredible. When you hear the level and the numbers of people that they're considering letting out. And Julian, as you said, and we should underscore, he is not convicted yet of anything, and he won't even be allowed to be on an ankle monitor at a private location outside of Belmarsh. It's unbelievable. And Julian is contradicting what Belmarsh officials are saying about the spread of coronavirus. He believes there are much more deaths within the inmate population than the one official count, possibly 2 that people are entertaining, and that the virus was, quote, ripping through the prison, is what Julian said. Why are the UK Department of Justice not investigating these claims?
Well, not for the first time. Julian is telling the truth and the officials are lying. That's, in a way, the whole point of Julian Assange. As it happens, I have very close contact with the Prison Officers Association of the prison staffs. And I can tell you that coronavirus is ripping through Belmarsh Prison and many other prisons too. And they are as concerned about that as we, who are concerned about the prisoner, Julian Assange, are. Because it's their members that are going down like flies. 150 of their members in Belmarsh Prison are in self-isolation. And that's the staff. What about the prisoners?
Yeah.
It is incredible. There's no PPE, there's no masks, there's no gloves, there's no separation possible in a jail. It's mass murder waiting to happen.
And George, lastly, critics of this situation are now comparing the UK justice system to that of Iran now, citing that the newly released Mrs. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, because of COVID-19, she is now out. Having been a member of parliament for so many years, how do you take that comparison? I imagine this is supposed to be a slight.
It's deeply humiliating. It's a sad day when the prisons in Iran are being emptied of prisoners, including someone they claim is a British spy, Nazanin Ratcliffe, and she's now being released on humanitarian grounds for fear of her contracting coronavirus. But the British will not release Julian Assange, their political prisoner. The Australian Parliament spoke out with great courage and clarion clarity in the last 24 hours, but you can't find a single person, not a single person in the British Parliament that will raise their voice, making the kind of demands that I'm doing now here on your show. So not only are our prisons shaming themselves in relation to the Iranian, so is our Parliament shaming itself in relation to our old friends in Australia.
That is absolutely the best last word for today, George. George Galloway, always appreciate your take. Thank you. Well, for many of us, we have never experienced or had to go through quarantine, but for one profession, they have had to do it every single time before they go on their mission. RT's Farron Fronzak is joining us now with more on this. So, Farron, with all that's happening right now on Earth, space is apparently now the safest place to be.
You probably could say that, Manila. And, just hours ago, actually, those 3 astronauts, they were made it to the International Space Station, and they spoke to reporters saying that they knew, a year ago that they were going to be put through quarantine, but what they didn't know was that the rest of the world was going to be joining them. Well, Thursday, the U.S.-Russian space crew blasted off in Kazakhstan, and about 6 hours later, they docked with the ISS. Now, those astronauts did all their prep work in Russia, and space officials there had taken a lot of extra precautions to protect the crew during training and pre-flight preps following the outbreak of the coronavirus. Now, the 1 astronaut and 2 cosmonauts, they floated into the space station one by one, joining the 3 that are already there. Now, the newest crew members, they're going to stay till October, keeping it until SpaceX launches a pair of NASA astronauts from Florida's Kennedy Space Center as early as next month, which actually will be the first launch in the U.S. since 2011. Now, the astronauts spoke Friday about what it's like to be up there with all that's going on down here.
It is quite surreal for us to see this whole situation unfolding on the planet below. We can tell you that the Earth still looks just as stunning as always from up here, so it's difficult to believe all the changes that have taken place since both of us have been up here.
Now, Manila, it's kind of ironic because those astronauts, they realized that their return date actually mirrors NASA's most catastrophic accident on a journey to the moon that triggered the most daring and successful rescue in NASA's history. Take a look.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we have a problem.
There it is, one of the most famous lines in Hollywood. The 3 astronauts are going to return to Earth the same day, 50 years ago, that the 3 astronauts aboard Apollo 13 came home. Now, it has been called a successful failure after the astronauts were safely returned to Earth despite an oxygen tank explosion, which put their lives in major jeopardy. Now, astronaut Jim Lovell was on that mission back in 1970 and reflects on what happened 50 years later.
13, not successful in its initial mission, was very successful in binding back together the people of the United States and the world and the space program as to how people can take almost a complete disaster and turn it into something that's very successful.
Now, all 3 of Apollo 13's astronauts say they never gave a thought to their mission number as they blasted off for the moon 50 years ago. Never mind that the liftoff actually occurred at 13:13 Houston time on April 11th, 1970. But the way Lovell sees it, he says that he is incredibly lucky despite all of these unlucky 13 numbers, saying that not only did he survive, he is still around 50 years later to reflect on this amazing anniversary.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Are astronauts superstitious?
I don't know. But what is very weird, though, too, is here you have this whole coronavirus thing happening. You had Tom Hanks, who played Jim Lovell, and
who was sick,
who just
coronavirus.
Exactly. Very, very strange.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
Twilight Zone music.
13 weird.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Farron Fronzak, thank you for that story. Okay, the head of the World Health Organization tells President Trump to not politicize the virus. How is America handling this pandemic? Our political panel is going to weigh in. And then later at the Sports HQ, Regina Ham brings us some startling comments regarding the postponed Tokyo 2020 Olympics. So we'll be right back.
Join me every Thursday on The Alex Salmond Show, when I'll be speaking to guests on the world of politics, sport, business, and show business. I'll see you then.
Прекрасный сон, он всегда был рядом со мной. Когда в себя делаешь полный глоток воздуха, начинаешь выходить за пределы атмосферы, видишь землю, плывешь. Хочется опять отдохнуть, оттолкнуться и полететь. Больше 11 лет, период, когда я был по медицинским показателям негоден. Но не сломался, не сдался, убедил в том, что я готов. Когда я решился на полет, и для семьи был маленький шок, никто этого не ожидал.
Расставаться тяжело, на самом деле. К этому нельзя привыкнуть, нет. Каждый раз думаешь, дайте силы пережить.
Чем старше становлюсь, тем страшнее становится. Понимаю, что человек, если что-то произойдет, он, в принципе, ничего не сможет там сделать.
Хожу я в путешествие тоже для своих, в том числе потому, что мне надо каждый раз доказывать и своей супруге, что я мужчина, настоящий мужчина, что я еще готов и могу сделать безумные поступки.
As Americans continue to hunker down at home, the slow drip of new information on COVID-19 have families split on how to live with this new reality. Now, debates on wearing masks, who's most vulnerable, who's highest risk, how long will this new normal last? Meanwhile, earlier this week, a surprise announcement from the Sanders campaign, Bernie effectively calling it quits and handing the nomination to Joe Biden. So joining us to discuss all of these hot topics, Dee Watkins, he's an acclaimed author and college professor, and Ed Martin, best-selling author and president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagle Forum, are joining us today. So gentlemen, good to see you. It's been a while. So I want to go over to Dee first. Now that this virus has been going on in the U.S. a few months, we can see a trend of where and who it's impacting the most. On a heat map, Dee, we are seeing places like New York City, Detroit, and New Orleans light up that map. Those are predominantly black neighborhoods. How do you read those numbers?
Well, there's a number of things that we can tie those numbers to. One, African Americans in this country are less likely to have insurance. Two, they're more susceptible to diabetes, asthma, and things like that because of living conditions in predominantly black areas. And three, a lot of African Americans are being deemed as essential employees. They're the people working at a lot of these markets and these delivery services and are incarcerated. So any and everywhere the virus can spread is hitting them more. I think it's important for people to know that the virus doesn't discriminate, but at the same time, if you are a person and you don't have a lot of resources, then you are going to be on the front lines and most likely get the virus.
Yeah, obviously population density. Ed, what's your take?
Well, first of all, it's very important to note that, as you point out, the hardest hit are in blue areas, which are typically Democrat. New York City, Detroit, even up in San Francisco area. And the whole federal government, doesn't matter what party you are, has motivated and has mobilized to do everything they can to mitigate that. Here's the one thing I'd say, and Dee is exactly right. If the virus is colorblind, it's going to get to everybody and every population. I think we shouldn't ignore some of the data that's showing that African Americans are hit harder. We should address that, and I think we are. And look, I think there's plenty of time in the future to look at who moved slowly. I think New York City was a little slower, but that shouldn't matter now. What matters now is get everybody well, get testing going in the right direction, and I think we're seeing that. I think you're seeing success in fighting what is really a hidden menace, something we couldn't have expected.
Ed, sticking with you here, the president's response to all of this, I think no matter who is sitting in the Oval Office, they're going to be damned if they do and damned if they don't. But it seems to fall down party lines in that Republicans think Trump should have taken a more measured approach like that of Sweden, who only quarantined high-risk or vulnerable people, whereas Democrats think everything should be locked down and everybody, and even this lockdown isn't going far enough. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think you're right. Look, it's a lose-lose situation, right? If you do everything you can to try to fight for mitigation and social distancing, we're still having death. You know, it's hard to measure how many lives you saved. And I think you're kind of right. Look, the President Trump, you would have thought, would have instinctively wanted to keep the economy going, to try to wait till the last minute. He listened to his experts, and he did what I think he had to do, which was lock things down and move that way. And he's even slower now in terms of some of the Republicans want to open up faster. Nancy Pelosi came out today and she said, you don't do it too fast. I think the president's got to listen. Ultimately, though, we're going to get to a point where the nation is going to have to let the leaders decide when we're going to take some risks to go back to work. At that point, some of us are going to get sick again. Some are even going to die. But this initial burst, as Diaz pointed out, a lot of people are vulnerable that have less opportunity, less structure. We've had to move and build hospitals and build ventilators and spend money. Look, Trump spent more money than I would as a conservative ever wanted to see. And we threw money at the problem, in part because it's that big a problem.
Dee, how do you think the president's handling it?
You know, I think that regardless of who's in the Oval Office, it would have been a crazy situation, because our country, as strong as we are, we didn't have the necessary. We weren't prepared for a virus. What I don't like about what the president has been doing is just the gross misinformation. When his first press conference, he was saying that only 11 people have it, and it's all okay. It's going to go away. And I know that as a leader, you don't want your nation to panic, but you also never ever want to deliver any type of language that would lead people to not take it as serious as they should.
And
so I would just say from that's my major problem. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think both of you kind of know that the president is in kind of a tough situation, no matter who's in charge, right? So last question here is to both of you about Bernie. Dee, I'm going to let you continue on this. Is it safe to say that Biden is the presumptive nominee, and now that Biden is already saying, acting like he is, that he will choose a woman as his running mate, many people believe it'll be someone like Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams. Do you think that that'll be the Dems' silver bullet come November by picking a woman of color?
At the end of the day, I've spent time with Stacey Abrams, and I've spent time with Kamala Harris, and I think they're two amazing people. But I care. What I really, really care about is what is Biden going to do? What are you going to do? I can care as much about who his running mate is as I really care about Mike Pence. Like, nobody talks about Mike. Nobody knows what Mike Pence does. And at the end of the day, I want to know, what are you going to do to get this country back on track? People want to work. People are tired of starving. People want to make money. People want to be able to take care of their families. You can pick Jesus Christ or LeBron James as the running mate. I want people to work and make money and be able to take care of their families.
Ed, same thing. Biden trying to deliberately choose perhaps a woman of color. I mean, is he just trying to check off the diversity boxes?
Well, I mean, certainly that's part of it. But look, let's be honest now. Let's cut right through this. Biden and Kamala Harris are the two candidates for president that have the most endorsements of the swamp, the establishment of the Democrats. So to Dee's point, what will Biden do in office? He'll do the same thing the Democrats have done for 25 years, which is roll over for Wall Street, not be really progressive, and they won't be successful, is my estimation. But Kamala Harris, she's definitely the pick. And it's because the swamp wants them, and the swamp will get what they want, and they'll lose in the fall, is my opinion, because nobody wants to vote for the same old. No, they won't be motivated by it. They won't be excited by it.
All right, we have to leave it right there.
Republicans roll over for Wall Street too.
Let's face it, guys. Everybody rolls over for Wall Street.
We can do another show on that. I'm with you.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Lee Watkins, Ed Martin, always an enlightening panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's head over to Regina Ham at the Sports HQ. Regina, the Tokyo Olympics look like they found a plan to make the games happen. I know they're pushing it off till next year, but now even that's on shaky ground?
It feels like it's constantly developing, Manila. And after that decision was made to postpone the Tokyo 2020 Olympics to July 2021, now it seems that all left to do is hammer down the details. But that doesn't even sound as easy as it might seem, as 2021 is even up in the air. Coronavirus cases are continuing to spike in Japan, and that is Tokyo Olympic CEO Toshiro Muto worried that 2021 is going to be in question. Muto said it wasn't a guarantee the games would happen if conditions worsened, and he wasn't in a position to give a clearer answer. The games were set to open on July 23rd, 2021, followed by the Paralympic Games on August 24th of the same year. After the decision was to postpone in March, the financial costs concern a lot of people. Those games, that would range in billions of dollars, between 2 to 6 in estimates. Olympic organizers did take out insurance for the event, but it's unclear if the postponement of the games qualifies for coverage. Another discouraging sign was the removal of the Olympic flame from public rooms at Fukushima Prefecture. Muto explained it was removed by the Tokyo 2020 committee with no further elaboration. Many hope that the IOC will decide to take it on a world tour and use it as a symbol of hope against the virus. And Manila, you really think the Olympic flame, that would be the ultimate symbol. The Olympics unite people from all walks of ethnicity, religion, culture, and having that maybe on a world tour when it's safe to travel again, of course, would be something that would keep everybody unified.
Yeah, I mean, I can't believe that they're even reconsidering 2021 at this point.
That's over a year away, but maybe that's a point of how serious it is with the coronavirus and how seriously sports organizers are taking it.
You know what that tells me is perhaps the Olympic Committee knows more information than they're letting on, because if they think this is still going to be impacting us next year,
I mean,
they know
you even have the XFL, they're shutting down operations. They were supposed to have a 2021 season, now not happening.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Regina Ham, thank you for that. And we will have a lot more news coming up for you at 3 p.m. Eastern. New York City is continuing to see the worst impact nationally from the virus as an island nearby becomes a burial ground for numerous bodies. Mass graves, we're talking here. And then we'll speak with the CEO of Mammoth Biosciences on the new gear coming out to help test people for the coronavirus. We'll have all that and more coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern, so stay tuned. Make sure you download our brand new free app, by the way. It's called Portable TV. It is free. You can catch up on all the news 24/7. I'm Manila Chan. We'll be back.
The world is driven by dreamers, shaped by thinkers, and those with vision.
Who dares, thinks. We dare to ask.
Max Kaiser's Financial Survival Guide. Housing bubble? Oh, you mean there's a downside to artificially low mortgage rates? Don't get carried away. Watch Kaiser Report.
With the coronavirus now officially declared a pandemic, the world faces the additional burden of an oil market collapse. This comes at a time when demand for crude was already low. Some are calling this the ultimate perfect storm. How this all ends is anybody's guess.
Let's roll! their money, but we got our soul. Let's roll, and we give them control. 'Cause they got their money, but we got our soul.
Welcome to Redacted Tonight VIP. I'm Naomi Paravani, your guest anchor for the apocalypse. Now, I know everyone is having a hard time, except for bank robbers. You know, no one is showing their full face in public. If you saw a guy with a ski mask and rubber gloves on, you'd think, wow, what a responsible gentleman. Let me show you where the safe is. Anyways, we got a great show for you tonight. We're going to talk about pandemic profiteering, some surprising recipients of stimulus money, and some really morbid news about Rikers Island. And yes, I know Rikers Island is already a very morbid institution. But first, I'm joined by Redacted Tonight host, Lee Camp, and Redacted Tonight correspondent Natalie McGill to discuss the end times. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks for having me as a guest on my show.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
You're invited all the time. Open invitation.
Thank you.
So, guys, I want to know what your plan is for when society comes to an end and we need to ration pages of Lee's book for toilet paper and people with guns shake you down for your last box of pasta because that's all you have in your house, and that's how you pay taxes now because, and they're in charge because they have all the guns.
My book is going to be currency when the hits the fan, all right?
I got chapter 2.
Yeah, I got chapter 2. People are going to be hungry for it. Come on.
But I wanted to talk about, I think it's on a lot of people's minds, like how the country responded to the crisis right after 9/11. Like, what's the difference between now and then? Like, remember they were like, oh, if we don't go outside, the terrorists will win. And now it's like, if you go outside, the virus will win. So,
I mean, I think what was as horrible as 9/11 was, it's obviously easier for us as a country to rally around two cities, New York City and DC, and now you just have the same happening everywhere at the same time. It's kind of like there's a national syncing up of everyone's periods.
Yeah.
In my scenario,
and everyone's mad at each other. They're like, hey, didn't you read the sign? Get back inside.
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities to 9/11, absolutely. But then it was, the nation came together to be like, we need to these motherfuckers up. Like, it was like, let's bomb a country. Everyone got behind Bush, and they didn't even bomb the country, the people that actually did it. They went after Iraq, right? And Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. So it was just like this anger, like, let's just kill people. Who cares? And so I think that is the difference. Whereas now it's an internal virus we're fighting, an internal enemy.
Yeah.
But
it's so confusing for us.
It is, because we can't bomb it. I mean, we tried, but we can't. It's tough to bomb.
I mean, I tried the drone, but
yeah.
If people can shoot at it,
I'm for the drone trials. I'll volunteer.
But the other difference, I think, is it's showing holes in the American system, in the unfettered capitalist system. Like, these things are falling apart because there was no buffer there for a crisis. People were already pushed to the brink. They're already working their asses off. They're already having trouble feeding their families. And then you put this on top of it, and all the structures that are supposed to protect people are not there. And so I think it's exposing America in a way that 9/11 did not.
Yeah. I mean, I think even after the number of infections subside, I think the virus is still going to win if the way we run this country remains the same after all of this is done. Like, if we don't shift from profit-based healthcare, the virus wins. If we don't even entertain a $15 minimum wage for all the people who are like delivering our food and like giving us food to supermarkets, the virus wins.
Yeah, everybody gets the virus.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that desperately need to change, and
That's fascinating. It is a beautiful work, but is this the painting that King Louis XII ordered from Leonardo in 1507 and that Andreas Solario brought to France in 1509? Fortunately, the Abbey has an extensive archive going back many hundreds of years. And here we find an astonishing eyewitness account.
Dat voorzijde koorhangt en is doen.
It is said that the painting is made after an original painted on.
Needed them for ourselves. We have plenty before the surge. In New York, they need far fewer hospital rooms or far fewer hospital beds in particular than we thought. And I have to say, Dr. Birx told me that 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. Remember, you said, that number's too high. We don't need that many. And based on what she said and others, we did what we had to do. We actually gave the maximum. We built Javits. We sent the ship in. We then made the ship COVID because, you know, there weren't a lot of people on the roads. You didn't have the accidents that we thought, other unrelated accidents. Nobody driving. You know, normally you have a lot of car accidents. You have a lot of motorcycle accidents. You have people going to the hospital. We didn't have that. We had almost none of it. So a lot of things have happened. I think we have a chance to be stronger than before. I really do. I think the stimulus is very important, what we're doing. I think it's very, very important. Please, go ahead.
Mr. President, may I ask you about credit and debt as well? Many American individuals, families have had to tap their credit cards during this period of time, and businesses have had to draw down their credit lines. Are you concerned, Mr. President, that may hobble the U.S. economy? All of that debt, number one. And number two, would you suggest to credit card companies to reduce their fees during this time?
Well, it's something that we've already suggested. We're talking to them. Business interruption insurance. I'd like to see these insurance companies. You know, you have people that have paid. When I was in private, I had business interruption. When my business was interrupted through a hurricane or whatever it may be, I'd have.
Michael, can it be broken?
Yes, it absolutely can be broken. I'm proof that it can be broken. But it's the thing is, more young people have to know.
Otherwise. In the conversations, we heard misleading and sometimes false information about how COVID-19 related testing and treatment would be covered by the plan and the circumstances under which it would be a pre-existing condition. So of the millions who are uninsured, there will be many more who will still be in debt during this crisis or be put in debt during this crisis because they were lied to about their coverage. But in all fairness, they're salespeople. It's kind of their job to lie and sell things. And our economy runs on lies and dead grandpas. I don't make the rules. Now let's.
Hey everybody, this is PJ recording once again from my closet in Brooklyn. The Reply All team is still sheltered in place in various places. We're still working on new shows for you. In the meantime, for people who just want a tiny break from coronavirus stuff, we wanted to rebroadcast two of our favorite old stories. They're actually both super tech reports. One is one that I investigated, one is one that Alex investigated, and we put them together. If anybody who wants more coronavirus information right now, as we said last week, our colleagues over at Science Versus are doing a great job with this. They just put out an episode about something I was wondering, which is like, how worried do you have to be when you go to the grocery store, and what can you do to save at the grocery store right now? Also, another little show, Every Little Thing, they just did a great episode where they talked to essential workers. One of the surprising things is just how many people constitute an essential worker. Like their first phone call, I'm going to play a clip of it, but it's somebody who works as a mental care person.
So my name is Jacob, and that's super boring, but I am a label printer service technician. So basically I go around to all of our local warehouses, Amazon, pharmaceutical, and medical companies. I go every week to send coronavirus tests and ship them out all over the country. So I go in, and if things aren't printing right, I figure out why, replace parts. But my main job is just going through and cleaning everything to make sure it's still working correctly.
How have these last few weeks been for you?
So it's interesting. I mean, I'm one of the only technicians that's actually leaving our office now because most places are closed down or not accepting visitors. But I go to our customers that are mission critical, I guess you could say.
Are you worried for your own health?
A little bit. Obviously, everyone's a little freaked out, but we've had to just kind of work like nothing's happening. It's kind of crazy. I mean, I'm just a printer repair guy, but I'm realizing how many people, they say essential workers, how many people really are essential to like keep the world running. It's weird to think that me going through and wiping down a printer with some rubbing alcohol can help save lives.
That's every little thing. If you want to hear the whole episode, we'll have a link in the show notes. As for us, like I said, we are giving you 2 classic super experts this week. We'll be back soon with new stories. And if you right now have lived their whole lives online and you're running into a technical supportable problem, we would love to try to help. If you have a super tech support right now, send us an email, replyall@gimletmedia.com, subject line super tech support. And if we think we can help, we'll get back to you. Okay, stay safe, everybody. We miss you. We will talk to you soon. Here's the episode.
This is just a quick language advisory for this episode. Throughout the course of recording this story, every single person, both hosts and guests, used the word barter when they meant bargain. We know that it's wrong. We won't do it again.